What is the true story of Native Americans? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes alive and every video immerses you in the destiny of those who shaped the world. Today, prepare yourself to travel across the Great Plains, sacred mountains, and red deserts of an ancient continent. Long before borders, before flags, before modern cities, powerful nations inhabited these lands now known as the United States. Cherokees, Lakotas, Apaches, Hopis, Iroquois, Navajos. Each name carries a world, a language, a memory, a way of seeing the world. From teepees to longhouses, from ceremonial dances to cosmogonic tales, these peoples built rich cultures, deeply rooted in the earth and sky. But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. Around 20,000. Before Christ, the Earth is experiencing the last convulsions of the Ice Age, which profoundly shaped the environments and lifestyles of human populations. Vast ice caps still cover northern Europe, most of Scandinavia, and significant areas of northern Asia. In America, half of present-day Canada is trapped in a massive ocean of ice, with thickness reaching several kilometers in places. The deserts of the Sahara and Gobi are more humid than today, while sea levels are significantly lower by more than 100 meters, exposing stretches of coastlines that will gradually disappear with the subsequent melting of the ice. In this cold and often hostile universe, climatic conditions freeze entire regions for months, limiting the availability of plant resources. The landscapes are dominated by tundra and frozen steppe, offering little floral diversity but still sheltering robust herbivores. Human groups, scattered at more temperate latitudes or sheltered around less frozen corridors, are organized according to ancient survival patterns, mixing big game hunting, targeted gatherings, and regular movements. The powerful atmospheric and oceanic dynamics of this time determine the habitable areas and influence migratory routes. Temperature variations, even minimal, can oscillate between sudden warmings and renewals of glacial advances, altering movement corridors. Human populations, originating from a long evolution tracing back to Africa, where Homo sapiens appeared about 300,000 years ago, constantly adapt to the conditions encountered. For millennia, they have already settled in the Middle East, Southern Europe, and South Asia, before venturing towards Southeast Asia. By 20,000 Xiaomi. Before Christ, Oceania is already reached, Australia having been populated possibly 50,000 to 60,000 years ago by migratory waves that crossed bodies of water, now dried up or reduced, thanks to lower ocean levels. The access now opened by Beringia, the land bridge connecting eastern Siberia to Alaska, marks new stages in human dispersion. This Beringia, at times several hundred kilometers wide, constitutes a major corridor allowing, shortly before 15,000 before Christ, crossing towards the American continent. In the heart of these demanding environments, megathermal fauna occupies a preeminent place. The term megathermal refers to large mammals adapted to cool climates, such as woolly mammoths, mastodons mostly found in North America, or giant ground sloths of South America. In cold Eurasia, woolly rhinoceroses coexist with steppe bison, while in Australia, imposing marsupials like the pallorquest survive, albeit already declining due to increasing human pressure. Mammoths, recognizable by their curved tusks and thick coat, are hunted for their meat, fat, bones with countless uses, and ivory, valued for making tools and ornamental objects. Mastodons, on the other hand, resemble modern elephants in silhouette, but have distinctive crested molars that differentiate them paleontologically. The intensive hunting of these species, coupled with climate evolution, gradually leads to the reduction of megafauna populations all over the planet, initiating an extinction process that will profoundly affect ecosystems. In this constraining living environment, mobility remains an essential survival strategy. Hunter-gatherers primarily seek out steppe tundra corridors rich in game, moving with the seasons, watching for the availability of edible plants in the milder valleys, and exploiting water points that concentrate prey and aquatic resources. Although nomadic, some groups may establish more permanent camps during the warmest part of the year, organized around lightweight structures adapted to low temperatures made of bones and skins. Ethnic groups living near glacial fronts must anticipate the sudden scarcity of game when the glaciers advance, while others, further south, benefit from slightly greater biodiversity. In the long term, this geographic fragmentation fuels significant genetic and cultural mixing, giving rise to a whole mosaic of differentiated human groups. In some regions, with a less extreme climate or more fertile lands, agricultural innovation emerges towards the end of the period. In the Levant, an area including present-day Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and the southern part of Turkey, the first archaeological evidence of cereal domestication such as barley or einkorn gradually appears around 10,000 Shurb before Christ. A few thousand years later, in China, the first experiments on millet or rice begin in the valleys of the Yellow River Huang, He and the Yangtze Jiang, benefiting from varied climates and an abundance of wetlands. This birth of agriculture does not occur suddenly. It results from a long observation of wild plants, coupled with the flexible settlement of certain groups. Camps gradually transform into semi-sedentary hamlets, where the distribution of tasks, monitoring a few plots, harvesting wild grasses, storing in rudimentary reserves, initiates a shift that will radically change the fate of part of humanity. Across the planet and over thousands of kilometers, many other populations remain fully anchored in the way of life of specialized hunter-gatherers. In Eastern Europe, for example, true traditions of wild horse hunting can be observed in the thawed plains of present-day Ukraine. In Central Asia, towards Kazakhstan or prehistoric Mongolia, herds of large herbivores, such as the saigas, enduring antelopes, play a major role in sustenance. In Africa, groups continue to practice the gathering of fruits, berries, and tubers, complemented by the selective hunting of herds or solitary animals, such as the oryx or the gazelle. These populations, adapted to their environment, do not necessarily need to cultivate to survive, and many thus retain mobility as their main asset. Agriculture is then just one of the multiple responses to climatic and environmental evolution, viable mainly in river basins and richer lands. In parallel, early signs of long-distance trade develop, showing that the societies of this time do not necessarily live in a closed system. Obsidian, a glassy volcanic rock of intense black, is particularly coveted for the crafting of exceptionally sharp blades and points. It originates from localized deposits, often volcanic, found in the Middle East, as well as in Anatolia, present-day Turkey, certain islands of the Eastern Mediterranean, or regions of East Africa. Yet, tools or obsidian shards are found hundreds of kilometers from their source, attesting to a network of exchanges where the rock is transported in successive stages, either through direct contacts between groups or via multiple intermediaries. The same goes for marine shells, collected on shores or on exposed coastlines before the sea level rises, then exchanged inland, often becoming symbols of prestige or funerary ornaments. Red ochre pigments are also detected, used for body painting, decorating rock walls, or accompanying the deceased during funerary ceremonies. The discovery of these pigments far from their extraction sites indicates the presence of trade, modest in quantity, but significant in terms of cultural interaction. 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 All these exchanges, sometimes over hundreds of kilometers, create the illusion of a proto-globalized network, admittedly rudimentary compared to our modern means, but already capable of facilitating the circulation of objects, ideas, and techniques. Nomadic groups, who traverse vast spaces during their seasonal migrations, encounter other populations, exchange stories, weave transient or lasting alliances, and barter rare goods. Glaciers and natural barriers, of course, limit the extent of some movements, but human curiosity, the quest for exceptional resources, and the desire to maintain good relations with neighboring communities stimulate these early economic and cultural networks. In certain cultures, obsidian is linked to rituals or beliefs, which enhances its symbolic dimension and may increase its exchange value. Shells can be transformed into ornamental pearls, medallions, or inserted into ceremonial objects intended to honor the spirits of nature. In most archaeological sites of this period, there are discrete but revealing traces of this dynamism. Thus, fine points crafted from distant obsidian appear in camps where local stone is nonetheless abundant, proving the special value attributed to this material. Fragments of shells from a still unidentified coastline in the Nile Valley suggest the presence of ephemeral networks linking the interior of the African continent to coastal areas. Sometimes, marine mollusk shells adorn graves located hundreds of kilometers from the sea, highlighting a particular status of the deceased or establishing a symbolic link with water, the source of life. Rare necklaces of finely ground ochre, worn by individuals carefully buried, testify to an aesthetic concern and homage rituals that go beyond the mere necessity of survival. It is also noteworthy that this period, still marked by cold, sees the emergence of innovations in the management and processing of food resources. Where the warmth is sufficient, small silos dug into the ground or storage pits, covered with stones, begin to appear to protect provisions from the weather and animals. Communities settled near major rivers such as the Euphrates or the Tigris in the Middle East can store wild grains, fish for small fish, and rely on more stable resources during times of scarcity. In forested or mixed areas, acorns, hazelnuts, and berries are occasionally exploited, complemented by the protein intake from hunting deer, roe deer, and the highly coveted bovines, such as the aurochs, the wild ancestor of modern cattle. This progressive diversification explains why some groups were able to take the step towards plant and animal domestication once the climate became milder, while others retained a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle adapted to their territories. Social grouping at this stage is often dictated less by formal hierarchies than by the expertise of certain members, shamans, great hunters, healers, or fire specialists, capable of guiding their peers in tool fabrication, lunar cycle observation, or the preparation of propitiatory rituals. The transmission of knowledge, mostly oral, allows for the development of a collective memory, remembering traveled routes, favorable water points, places to harvest clay or stone, valleys to avoid during floods. This memory, passed down from generation to generation, shapes the identity of clans and underlies the emergence of traditions that were likely very rich, but whose material trace remains tenuous on an archaeological scale. However, parietal art, as seen in certain caves in Europe or Western Asia, reveals a deep symbolic universe. Representations of herds, stylized human figures, negative handprints coated in ochre, mappings of the spiritual world linking the clan to tutelary animals. At the turn of $12,000 to $10,000 before Christ, the global climate experienced strong upheavals. The large glaciers began to retreat significantly. New spaces opened up in the north, while precipitation increased elsewhere, gradually transforming the arid steppes into prairies or sparse woods. In some areas, the melting of immense glacial water reserves led to cataclysmic floods, altering the course of some rivers and reshaping valleys. The end of the last glaciation was not linear. Warming phases alternated with setbacks, known as cold regressions, such as the so-called Younger Dryas event around 10,800 before Christ, which temporarily slowed the rise in temperatures. Human populations were directly affected by these fluctuations. Supply strategies shifted, migration corridors evolved, and lands were reorganized based on the increased or reduced availability of certain resources. In the Levant, these climatic changes coincided with the rapid evolution of some pre-agricultural villages, forced to intensify the exploitation of wild cereals to compensate for the scarcity of other resources. Human migrations then continued at all levels. In Europe, the gradual retreat of ice liberated Scandinavia and created ecosystems that attracted reindeer, deer, and various game, leading to the settlement of hunter-gatherer groups in territories previously uninhabitable. In Asia, the strengthened monsoon could push some populations to settle at higher altitudes or to seek drier zones. Meanwhile, towards eastern Siberia, Beringia remained an essential corridor where some clans might take advantage of the opportunity to cross into America without encountering major obstacles when climatic conditions allowed. The gradual change in the coastal trail, induced by rising waters, would later close this land passage, further isolating America from Asia, but only after the initial settlement of Alaska and regions further south. In this vast panorama, the megafauna felt the increasing pressure of hunting acutely. Hunting practices intensified, particularly during glacial retreat periods when human population density began to increase in some fertile areas. Weapons were perfected: bone harpoons, spear throwers, fluted point bases, and sleek spears capable of piercing the thick skins of these large animals. Strategies for collective hunting, notably to trap a herd of mammoths or bison, sometimes involved entire groups and required coordination that already indicated a developed sense of tactics. This overexploitation, combined with climate evolution, compromised the natural reproduction of these species, whose growth cycle was slow given their body mass. Populations of large herbivores, so abundant during the glaciation, began a slow decline, paving the way for a major ecological readjustment that would continue until the beginning of the Holocene and beyond. In general, the material culture of this era illustrates the diversity of skills: lithic tools, often crafted using elaborate techniques, fine retouching, controlled flaking with soft percussion, varied in the shape of points according to hunting needs. Scrapers, burins, and chisels allowed working of hides, bones, or deer wood. Some areas, richer in high-quality flint or chert, became known supply points, and specialized expeditions were often conducted to gather materials to create tools throughout the year. Objects made from bone or deer wood complemented this equipment, notably for fishing: hooks, harpoons, sewing needles to assemble skins, or decorations, ornaments, and jewelry. Engravings on bones sometimes revealed geometric motifs, parallel lines, zigzags, which are associated with cultural symbols or counting days, or even lunar phases. Permanent mobility also encourages the use of temporary shelters that are easy to set up and take down, such as skin tents held up by mammoth bone frames or wood. In areas lacking large mammals, people manage with trunks, earth, and blocks of sod to build semi-buried huts that better retain heat. Despite these seemingly simple practices, groups take advantage of every innovation to improve their comfort and efficiency: tanning skins, designing insulating clothing, and inventing new cutting or scraping tools allow them to follow game with minimal energy loss. The hearths, fueled by rare wood or dried animal bones, often form the heart of social life at many sites. where discussions about the next hunting expedition, division of labor, and perhaps the transmission of mythological stories about ancestors and animal spirits take place. Around 11,000. Before Christ, a slow warming trend announces the gradual entry into the Holocene, a period that will see the disappearance of many continental ice caps. However, the world remains cold in vast regions, and ecosystems slowly rebuild around new plant and animal communities. The beginnings of agriculture in the Levant and China are still modest, simple attempts that, on a global scale, remain minor. The vast majority of humanity maintains a lifestyle of hunting and gathering, adapting their tools to the fluctuations of animal and plant species. The first interregional exchange networks no longer limit themselves solely to obsidian, but can include dyes, raw materials, ornaments, or dried goods providing dietary supplements. However, obsidian remains a very visible archaeological marker and reflects the vitality of these exchange flows. Gradually, as ice retreats further north, the distances traveled by some groups may increase, potentially improving the circulation of materials and information and transforming the human map, now stretched across almost all continents. More than just a simple paleoclimatic transition, this period witnesses the birth of numerous economic models conditioned by heterogeneous environments. In the Middle East, partial sedentariness is being experimented where water is abundant, while in northern Asia, some communities remain nomadic to follow the migrations of reindeer or bison. In Africa, local climate variations can create settlement hubs around lakes, rivers, and green areas quite different from the Australian systems, where hunting large marsupials and collecting bush seeds are daily activities. Despite these disparities, chemical or mineral, traces of exchanges show how humanity is already weaving vast and durable connections. Hunting, gathering, early agriculture, and long-distance trade coexist for millennia, laying the groundwork for an increasingly interconnected world to the extent that natural conditions allow. Each group influences its environment, whether through controlled burns to attract game to new grassy areas or temporary settlements around former glacial lakes filled with fish. The period from around 15,000 to 8,000 hours. Before Christ marks a decisive phase in the history of the initial settlement of North America. Scientists agree that human groups bearing great cultural diversity arrived on the continent via a land bridge connecting Asia and Alaska, Beringia. At the time, significant amounts of water were trapped as ice, lowering sea levels and exposing vast stretches of land between eastern Siberia and Alaska. These landscapes, dotted with grass tundras and steppes, hosted herds of migratory animals that were key resources for bands of hunter-gatherers. Climatic fluctuations, however, influenced the formation of glacial corridors further south, particularly in the area between the large ice caps that then covered the northern part of the North American continent. According to the hypothesis of an interior corridor, human groups advanced southward when an ice-free passage appeared. Simultaneously, other researchers support the possibility of a coastal route along the Pacific, where populations could have moved in rudimentary canoes, taking advantage of marine resources and shoreline fauna. Genetic markers have been identified that corroborate this dual hypothesis of migration. Studies of ancient and modern DNA in North American indigenous populations reveal the presence of several major haplogroups, including A, B, C, D, and X. These genetic segments suggest multiple origins in Asia, with a strong founder effect resulting from one or more migratory waves that used both coastal and inland routes. carriers of haplogroup X, less widespread than others, have puzzled researchers for several decades. Some specialists have proposed that the distribution of this relatively rare haplogroup in Siberia could result from independent migrations or small isolated populations that may have survived in glacial refuges. Others argue that it is preferable to interpret the data from a broader perspective, considering genetic flow over long periods. Clearly, the intense mobility of these hunter-gatherers, coupled with the mosaic of North American environments, led to rapid genetic intermixing. This fluctuation is reflected in the current diversity of Amerindian lineages, which continues to be studied and refined thanks to advances in DNA extraction and sequencing techniques. Among the most emblematic cultures of this first settlement, the Clovis tradition holds a central place. Initially identified in New Mexico, near the locality of the same name, it is characterized by finely crafted projectile points with a longitudinal groove, allowing them to be hafted onto spear shafts. Clovis objects demonstrate great mastery in stone tool-making and an advanced adaptation to hunting megafauna, including mammoths and other large herbivores. This culture, long considered the oldest in America, dominated the scientific debate until the discovery of new pre-Clovis sites. The Galt site in Texas revealed tools that bear a resemblance to Clovis while suggesting technological priority. Not far from there, Buttermilk Creek made headlines when meticulous excavations uncovered remnants dating back around 15,500 years, pushing back the presumed arrival of the Clovis by nearly 2,000 years. This revelation has prompted researchers to reconsider the linear model in which all populations first gathered in a single hub. Nowadays, the idea of multiple settlements, characterized by both coastal and inland groups, prevails in many analyses. Meanwhile, the cultural complex known as the Western stemmed tradition sheds light on another facet of this early colonization. Its projectile points, lacking the distinctive Clovis groove, feature a more or less elongated stemmed base. These relics have been found west of the Rocky Mountains, in regions including present-day Oregon, Idaho, and parts of Nevada. Excavations at Paisley Caves in Oregon have unearthed points associated with dates going back more than 14,000 years, suggesting contemporaneity or even precedence over Clovis. DNA analyses of fossilized excrement found on site confirm a very ancient human presence, indicating that Western stemmed tradition populations were already inhabiting these territories, while other groups were moving further east. Although this culture is less publicized internationally, it illustrates the diversity of technological responses to distinct environments. Instead of focusing on large game, some groups exploited a wide range of resources, including fish, small mammals, and seasonally harvested plants, thereby reinforcing their resilience in sometimes arid environments. Across the continent, the pursuit of megafauna was a crucial element of subsistence, but it was not without consequences for these large species. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, and other large animals gradually disappeared, a process of extinction that often coincides with human expansion. Although the Holocene warming played a role in habitat fragmentation, the hunting pressure exerted by mobile and skilled groups likely accelerated the decline of animal populations. Numerous clues, such as accumulations of bones bearing cut marks or remains of projectile points embedded in skeletons, attest to the extent of this predation. Clovis sites and those of the Western stemmed tradition frequently contain faunal assemblages indicative of collective feasts. However, humans did not limit themselves to hunting big game. Fishermen and wild plant gatherers played an essential role in daily survival, especially in coastal or marshy areas. These variations in resource exploitation illustrate the necessity for these early societies to diversify their approaches to adapt to environmental fluctuations and ensure the sustainability of their communities. In parallel with this anchoring in temperate and subarctic zones, the first Paleo-Eskimo communities appear in the Arctic. Specialists place their origin about 5,000 years ago, but some hypotheses suggest even older explorations towards the northern fringes of North America. The rapidity of linguistic diversification in these extreme regions is surprising, as is the adaptability to a harsh climate. The Paleo-Eskimo groups, ancestors of later Arctic cultures, possess specific hunting and fishing techniques, including the use of bone harpoons and the crafting of insulating clothing from sewn skins. Although they lived in hostile environments, their lifestyle was based on meticulous exploitation of marine fauna, such as seals and walruses, as well as on the seasonal capture of caribou. DNA analyses taken from human remains reveal a complex history marked by successive migrations and interactions with other populations. The coastal areas of the Arctic, free of ice during the few summer months, represented fundamental corridors of movement for these pioneers of the far north. Over time, they have left a cultural and genetic legacy to the Neo-Eskimo groups that followed them. The evolution of these different traditions, whether coastal or inland, demonstrates the flexibility of the first inhabitants of North America. Linguistically, the rapid emergence of multiple language families can only be explained by a strong demographic expansion coupled with repeated geographic separations. Researchers study the distribution of these languages to better understand the movements of ancient populations. The numerous lexical and grammatical variations suggest scenarios of successive splits, either within small isolated clans or in regions where the environment enforced many displacements. Some linguists attempt to reconstruct proto-languages to detect potential kinships among distant groups, but the complexity of borrowings, coalitions, and conflicts sometimes makes the task daunting. The initial branches sketched could be linked to these pioneers who, starting from Beringia, dispersed south, east, and west, covering immense territories over a few millennia. In this dynamic, the transmission of artisanal and spiritual knowledge contributed to the rise of a great variety of cultures. The study of rock art, music, and funerary rites gradually provides clues on how these primitive societies were formed, transformed, and then dispersed. Numerous archaeological sites scattered across the continent today extend the quest for these North American origins. Scientists have an increasingly sophisticated array of tools at their disposal, including advanced carbon-14 dating, fine stratigraphy, and geochemical analyses, to accurately determine the age and origin of discovered objects. Stone tools, bone remains, and primitive habitation structures provide information on the lifestyles of these pioneers. Evidence of hearths, food waste areas, and burials also testify to the beliefs and rites that may have developed in these ancient times. In some cases, colored pigments, like red ochre, suggest the existence of a form of symbolism or cultic practices. On an international scale, the study of the initial settlement of North America arouses keen interest as it sheds light on the adaptability of the human species to environmental challenges. Researchers share their discoveries through conferences, specialized publications, and increasingly through digital initiatives. Each new excavation, each new fragment of DNA brings a missing link to this millennial odyssey. The Archaic period, extending approximately from 8,000 to 1,000 before Christ, marks a major transition in the history of the prehistoric populations of North America. Following the end of the last glaciation, known as the Pleistocene, the climate gradually warmed, inaugurating the Holocene, an epoch characterized by a rise in global temperatures. This rise contributed to the dramatic melting of the vast glaciers that had until recently covered large portions of the continent. The landscapes underwent significant transformations. Ice sheets retreated northward, habitats once suffocated under the ice opened up to plants and animals, and rivers freed themselves from their icy covers, allowing increased circulation along river valleys. The North American world saw the advent of new ecosystems, including the expansion of forests in large areas further south, the gradual stabilization of the vast central plains, and the definitive configuration of certain lake basins. During this period, the Great Lakes were formed, resulting from the successive carving and filling of basins shaped by the ice. These lakes, notably Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron, became impressive reservoirs of fresh water, vital resources for the fauna and the human groups that settled on their shores. In this rapidly changing context, societies that had previously lived primarily by hunting, large game continued their adaptation. Gradually, they diversified their means of subsistence to exploit now varied resources. Former steppe lands became covered in forests. Iconic species such as mammoths and mastodons became scarce or even disappeared, while smaller animals proliferated in wet or wooded environments. Fish, notably salmon or various river fish, as well as plant resources, became increasingly important commodities for communities. This dietary evolution is visible in the regional differences in tools and settlement patterns. On the Atlantic coast, which at the time stretched along a shoreline in full recomposition, harpoon fishing developed. Local populations crafted sharp points from bone or deer wood, sometimes polished stone, which they attached to long poles carefully cut. With this instrument, they would harpoon migratory fish in areas rich in marine or estuarine fauna, such as the mouths of rivers flowing into the Atlantic Ocean. In the West, and more specifically in what is now the state of California, the Mediterranean climate, with its wet winters and dry summers, allows for the expansion of oak groves abundant in acorns, which become a crucial nutritional resource for many groups. The local populations develop techniques for collecting and processing acorns, using mortars or grinding stones to crush the nut before rinsing and cooking it. The high tannin content in acorns requires a careful preparation to eliminate the bitter and potentially toxic element. This intensive use of acorns allows for a relative sedentarization around natural orchards, where gathering remains profitable year after year. The transformation of these plant products is accompanied by an improvement of polished stone tools. More complex forms of management emerge, as one must plan the harvest, storage, and sometimes exchange with other communities located in less wooded areas. While this specialization is observed in more temperate or forested environments, Arctic regions in the north continue to see the development of strategies adapted to more extreme environments. The warming is not as noticeable in the polar zone, but marine ice recedes locally at certain times of the year, opening new navigation routes. The archaic Arctic communities, ancestors of some Inuit or Paleo-Eskimo peoples, primarily exploit marine mammals like seals or walruses, while tracking caribou during their seasonal migrations to open pasture areas. The movements remain essential and sometimes occur with the assistance of the oldest domesticated animal in North America, the dog. Its role begins to extend beyond simple companionship or hunting. It is now harnessed to small sleds, sometimes rudimentary, to transport supplies, driftwood, or hides. This invention of the dog sled represents a decisive logistical breakthrough. In a sense, it is one of the first vehicles utilized to move faster across snow or ice, long before the introduction of the horse by Europeans. The dog, domesticated for millennia, moreover occupies a notable place in archaeological assemblages of the Archaic period. A famous testimony comes from the Coaster site, located in what is now the Illinois Valley. In the strata corresponding to around 6,500 before Christ, archaeologists discovered graves where dogs were buried with particular care, sometimes even in the company of ornaments or symbolic deposits. This practice suggests that the animal was not only utilitarian, but also bore a spiritual or emotional value. Coaster illustrates a more advanced stage of interaction between humans and their canine companions, going beyond simple collaboration for hunting. The dogs were evidently integrated into human communities, benefiting from a status that could be honored at their death, as evidenced by these burials. Through these clues, we glimpse the emerging complexity of archaic societies, where the relationship with domesticated fauna is accompanied by growing social organization and ritual awareness. Over the millennia covered by the Archaic, technology continues to evolve. Stone knapping techniques improve, giving rise to bifacial or retouched-edged projectile points, adapted for medium-sized game hunting. The groups still frequently lead a nomadic lifestyle, but phenomena of seasonal habitation develop. In some areas, people erect temporary shelters in specific locations, then periodically return to benefit from the natural resources offering the most abundance at any given time of the year. Archaeologists thus find in certain localities superimposed levels of occupation, marking multiple returns to the same place over centuries or even longer. This reflects a fine knowledge of environmental cycles and an ability to pass on this information from generation to generation. With the definitive formation of the Great Lakes during the Holocene, new aquatic resources, such as freshwater fish and mollusks, also appeared. Populations settled around these lakes, exploiting the potential offered by the waterways, fishing, the transport of goods, and faster movement than through the underbrush. Rudimentary canoes, carved out of tree trunks, often allowed travel over modest distances on the water, well before the invention of the bark canoe known in more recent periods. These innovations strengthened the exchange capacities between nearby or sometimes more distant groups. This era perhaps saw the rise of certain local commercial or proto-commercial networks, since even in the Archaic period, raw materials from distant areas were found. Minerals and certain rare stones, like high-quality cherts, reached sites where they served to craft various tools. The Archaic period is also marked by the rise of early collective projects, visible in the archaeological record. The most striking example remains Watson Break, a site located in Louisiana and dated to around 3,500 before Christ. Consisting of 11 mounds arranged in a ring, this complex is considered one of the oldest mound constructions in North America. Each mound reaches several meters in height and is based on the voluntary contribution of earth and sediments by a community determined to build a coherent ensemble. Some see this as evidence of the emergence of social hierarchy, or, at least, of a collaborative organization capable of coordinating the labor necessary for the construction of large structures. Watson Break even predates famous sites like Poverty Point, a bit more recent, and proves that late hunter-gatherer societies or early horticulturists could already conceive and complete monumental works. Though the exact function of Watson Break remains subject to debate, various hypotheses highlight the ritual role. These mounds, sometimes called mound tombs, because of the presence of burials at similar sites, could have served as multiple ceremonial spaces, funerary, political, and social. They suggest a progressive development of beliefs around the cycle of life and death, and underline the human desire to mark the landscape durably, to assert a common identity or honor some of their deities or ancestors. The accumulated materials testify to successive construction events, suggesting that the space was expanded or remodeled several times according to changing needs and ritual intentions. The existence of such gatherings of the population to erect mounds signals that long before the era of the great Native American cities, some groups were already structuring around large-scale projects, requiring leadership, task, and time allocation, as well as a form of community engagement. In other regions of what is now the United States, including the Midwest and the East, less imposing structures also reveal the emergence of collective funerary practices associated with social differentiation. Small earthen or stone mounds, sometimes erected on hills overlooking a river, contain burials of several individuals embellished with personal items. Finely retouched projectile points, jewelry, tools intended for subsistence activities, and even red ochre pigments, signaling the symbolic nature of the ritual, have been discovered. The artifacts serve sometimes as a status marker, sometimes as a sign of affection for the deceased. Gradually, in these archaic societies, the living began to erect structures to honor their dead, ranging from simple tumuli to more elaborate configurations, already foreshadowing more sophisticated mound traditions that would flourish under later cultures, like Adena or Hopewell, centuries later. During this period, we also observe a greater linguistic diversity taking shape, even if prehistoric languages are not directly accessible to us. The distances imposed by the ever-expanding geography of human colonies, the variety of lifestyles, hunting, fishing, gathering, and early agricultural embryos in certain areas, contribute to the acceleration of regional cultural distinctions. Nomadic or semi-nomadic populations spread over a vast territory in a constantly evolving ecological context, creating a mosaic of subsistence traditions. On the plateaus and plains, bison is hunted in small groups during its migrations. In the eastern forests, deer and moose are tracked, sturgeon is fished around the major rivers, or wild berries and nuts are gathered. The ability to adapt to increasingly varied environmental niches clearly marks the ingenuity of these communities, which, facing a mild climate, diversify their approaches and perfect their techniques. In more inland regions, where today's Great American Plains stretch, the Holocene climate stabilization leads to the appearance of grasslands and grassy areas conducive to the movement of antelope or bison herds, although these have smaller populations than in some earlier periods and continue to fluctuate with natural conditions. Waterways, freed from seasonal ice, also allow better access to watering points for wildlife. Human settlements closely follow these movements while maintaining temporary camps adapted to collective or individual prey capture. Some archaeological sites reveal intense use of pits or rudimentary enclosures to channel animals during mass hunts. Thousands of bone remains pile up, attesting to the strategic importance of these sites in obtaining food and hides. Techniques for drying, smoking, or preserving meat evolve, allowing storage for leaner seasons. Thus, geography itself shapes the relationship with fauna and migration patterns, while influencing the links between different groups capable of exchanging or competing in exploiting these resources. As the influence of Holocene warming spreads, local fauna and flora change. Some cultures develop forms of territorial management where small-scale farming is carried out, especially for wild plants that will later be domesticated. Although the rise of agriculture in the American Southwest or the Mississippi Valley becomes truly significant only in later millennia, proto-agricultural evidence already appears. Sometimes squash or snack plants like sunflowers are found in archaic contexts, suggesting that the relationship between humans and edible vegetation goes beyond mere gathering. Observing growth cycles, progressively selecting the most productive seeds, and planning harvests are all milestones toward a more complex economic structure, task specialization, and potential demographic growth. The increasing structuring of communities is also noticeable in the evolution of their habitation sites. Where natural resources are abundant and regular, more permanent installations are distinguished, testimonies of extended seasonal habitation. Pits dug in the ground sometimes contain food reserves, whether dried fruits, tubers, or smoked meat. Indoor hearths indicate a new concern for thermal comfort, especially during cooler periods of the year. Villages or camps begin to have differentiated spaces, dedicated to sleeping, culinary preparation, or tool making, reflecting a new spatial organization compared to the completely nomadic life that prevailed at the end of the Pleistocene. On the other hand, some archaic sites highlight the construction of assembly or meeting structures, endeavors that require multiple hands, signaling social cooperation and an embryo of collective authority. Whether it's an emerging chieftaincy or an informal council, some form of coordination seems to have been necessary to manage task allocation, provision storage, and eventual redistribution during times of scarcity. In the southeast, the abundance of swamps, marshes, and waterways rich in fish and shellfish explains the regular presence of shell middens, where the remains of mollusk-based meals are piled up. These heaps of shells form small white hills that are easily spotted on the ground or from aerial surveys. Scientists find valuable information there about the diet and everyday objects of archaic groups. Among the layers of shells, they unearth projectile points, bone tools for gathering or processing aquatic animals, as well as fragments of early pottery in some areas near the coast. This rudimentary pottery, sometimes made with plant fibers mixed with clay, is used for cooking food or storage, two practices illustrating gradual changes in eating and organizing habits. Between the Southwest, the East Coast, the Arctic far north, the Central Plains, and California, the disparity in lifestyles during the Archaic period is considerable. However, commonalities connect these populations. The most important is their inventive adaptation to an environment that, over the long term, moves from the glacial era to increasingly temperate conditions, particularly in the middle latitudes. The engagement in collective constructions observed at Watson Break demonstrates that these groups are not merely isolated hunter-gatherers. Some share a desire to build symbolic or funerary spaces, gathering labor and coordinating large-scale efforts. The role of the dog, notably evidenced at Coster, testifies to a lasting companionship with humans, serving as both a companion and transport aid, and an individual honored in death. Everywhere, lithic or bone technology is perfected, while the intensive exploitation of certain plant and marine resources gives rise to cultural practices embedded in the local environment. The beginnings of uncertain agriculture, tool specialization, the initiation of long-term exchanges, and the erection of mounds already align several fundamental ingredients of a civilization being formed. Without possessing political structures as formalized as in later periods, archaic societies have indeed laid the foundation for a more complex organization where territorial management becomes crucial and the concerted action of multiple families, clans, or lineages proves critical for ensuring the survival and growth of the community. The cultural traditions known as Adena and Hopewell develop in the eastern part of what is now the United States from around 1000 before Christ and extend into the early centuries of our era. This vast region, primarily covering the Ohio Valley and some surrounding areas, is then covered with mixed forests, populated by deer, wild turkeys, and small mammals, while the streams and rivers provide abundant fishing resources. The local populations, descended from hunter-gatherer groups established for several millennia, begin to develop modest agricultural techniques and form sedentary communities, whose cohesion is reflected in new ritual practices. To better understand what unites and differentiates the cultural groups called Adena and Hopewell, it is essential to discuss their environment, their artisanal innovations, their beliefs, and the scope of the exchange networks that, at that time, extend well beyond Ohio. The first expressions of the Adena cultural complex appear around 1000 before Christ in the central Ohio Valley. This term has long been associated with a specific style of pottery, tools, and funerary objects, but today it refers to a broader horizon, encompassing various communities sharing common traits. Daily life is organized around small permanent or semi-permanent settlements, and the campsites are spread near waterways, facilitating fishing and nascent agriculture. Corn is not yet the ubiquitous element it will become later in other regions of North America, but early varieties, possibly imported from Mexico through slow and successive exchanges, begin to appear in some locations. Adena populations also practice the cultivation of sunflowers, squash, and other local plants, while continuing to hunt and gather wild fruits. One of the most spectacular contributions of the Adena tradition remains the construction of mounds, which are artificial earthworks whose height and volume vary considerably. These structures, often conical in shape, primarily served as funerary monuments, housing sometimes elaborate tombs where several individuals could be buried. The Adena communities used wood and sometimes entire trunks of cedar or maple to form internal funerary structures, upon which a pile of earth was then raised. Inside these mounds, prestige objects are also found, such as copper ornaments originating from the distant Great Lakes Basin, or mica jewelry, a mineral extracted from the Appalachian Mountains. Since the Adena period, the exchange and circulation of precious objects suggest a relatively extensive trade network, although it is still difficult to precisely measure its organization or trading methods. Around the 3rd century before Christ, ritual practices gradually evolved towards a more complex tradition, generally called Hopewell. The transition from Adena to Hopewell is not marked by a sharp break. Rather, it is a gradual transition, characterized by a geographical expansion and the emergence of a more assertive religious or shamanic elite. The sites of the Hopewell culture, mainly located in Ohio but also present in other neighboring states like Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, exhibit even more elaborate architectural and artistic characteristics. The conical mounds sometimes give way to earthen mounds with complex geometric contours, rectangular or circular, and a variety of earthworks forming enclosures appear. The most famous of these constructions remains the Serpent Mound, located in Adams County, southern Ohio. Serpent Mound, classified as an effigy mound, stretches in a long, sinuous shape that follows the contours of a plateau overlooking a creek. It measures about 400 meters in length. Representing a stylized serpent, it features a large loop at the tail end and a very pronounced head. Although its dating and precise belonging are still debated, many specialists link it to the legacy of the Adena and Hopewell traditions. Radiocarbon analyses performed on pieces of charcoal indicate successive periods of modification. According to the main hypotheses, Serpent Mound might have had a ceremonial function related to astronomical cycles or fertility rites. This structure receives particular attention from successive generations of archaeologists, as it bears witness to advanced expertise in earth manipulation and the symbolic interpretation of the landscape. The cultural framework, known as the Hopewell interaction sphere, is precisely defined by these large collective projects and by long-distance trade of prestige objects. In the case of the Hopewell culture, local populations acquired copper from the Great Lakes mines, particularly those in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where ancient multi-millennial extraction galleries exist. Mica, coming from the Appalachian Mountains, is crafted into thin sheets, sometimes cut into animal or human silhouettes. Hopewell artisans are also interested in obsidian, a glassy volcanic rock, rare in this part of the continent. One of the sources identified for the obsidian used by the Hopewell culture is located in the Yellowstone region, more than 2,000 kilometers west of Ohio. This material was mainly used for making projectile points and blades, but it could also serve to create decorative objects. The remarkable distance separating Yellowstone from the Ohio Valley demonstrates how far the trade networks, based on a system of alliance and barter, already extended across a large portion of the North American continent. The social structuring during the Hopewell era is also reflected in the symbolic richness of artistic production. The groups participating in this tradition possess a repertoire of emblematic animals, including the bear, puma, elk, and falcon, which are regularly represented on amulets, pendants, and ceremonial pipes. The stone known as pipestone or catlinite, a soft reddish rock extracted especially in the area of present-day Minnesota, is highly prized for carving effigy pipes. These pipes, whose ends are decorated with animals, are frequently associated with ritual or diplomatic contexts. In some tombs, one finds carved pipes representing birds with stylized plumage, carnivores with visible fangs, or even anthropomorphic figures with a bear's head. Archaeologists see in this the mark of a shamanistic belief system, where contact between the human world and the animal world plays a vital role. The shamanistic practices of the Adena and Hopewell cultures are reflected in the arrangement of funerary objects and traces of complex ceremonies. The tombs of the elites, located at the heart of the mounds, sometimes reveal the presence of individuals buried with sumptuous offerings, such as ornaments made of bear teeth or raptor claws. The medicine men, or shamans, likely had the mission to maintain harmony between the invisible forces and the community. This role was expressed through the use of sacred symbols, adornments testifying to a special relationship with spirit animals, and perhaps through the practice of ritual dances or trances aimed at communicating with the beyond. The success of these rites and the strong social cohesion around these ceremonies would have facilitated the implementation of large-scale projects, such as mounds and earthworks. The construction processes likely involved a large labor force organized to transport and compact earth using baskets. The architectural details reveal a well-thought-out distribution of sacred spaces, often surrounded by palisades or symbolic ditches, thus showing the collective effort invested in the visible manifestation of spirituality. At the same time, the production of utilitarian objects continues, and one sees improvements in pottery and stone knapping techniques. The ceramics, rudimentary during the Adena period, are refined under the influence of exchanges with other regions. The vessels become more varied, adapted for cooking and storing foodstuffs, while some more finely decorated vases testify to a ceremonial dimension. The flint and obsidian knappers develop remarkably symmetrical blades, sometimes of large dimensions, requiring a high mastery of flint knapping. There are also remains of shell carvings, likely from the coasts of the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic, proving that Hopewell trade networks extend beyond neighboring territories to include even more distant areas. A unique anecdote often attracts attention regarding funerary deposits: the discovery of flint blades reaching 30 centimeters or more, sometimes deposited intact as offerings. This fact intrigues not only because of the technical difficulty involved in knapping stone to such a length, but also due to the symbolic significance of these deposits. These blades, too fragile and precious for use as everyday tools, seem designed to impress, to highlight a high status, or to evoke the supernatural power associated with their creation. In some tombs, they are placed in close proximity to the deceased, possibly wrapped in organic fabrics or furs, now gone, but still sometimes detectable by microscopic traces on the blade surfaces. Archaeologists theorize these objects could have served a spiritual accompaniment role, intended to guide the deceased into the afterlife, or protect them from malevolent forces. The internal layout of certain Hopewell sites highlights the importance of these religious and ritual practices. Geometric ceremonial enclosures, sometimes composed of a perfect circle connected to a square by an elevated earthen passage, form true open-air complexes. Participants could gather in distinct spaces for different types of rituals: purification, offerings, processions. Archaeological excavations conducted in the Chillicothe region of Ohio have uncovered several complex sites where mounds align according to precise orientations, related to sunrise and sunset. Archaeologists see this as a probable observation of celestial phenomena or the marking of key dates in the agricultural cycle. Remains of broken pottery and intentionally broken pipes are sometimes found buried under dance surfaces, indicating that these sacred objects were sacrificed during solemn ceremonies. The distinction between Adena and Hopewell is also seen in the sophistication of goldsmithing and copper craftsmanship. Among the Adena, the use of copper is often limited to a few basic beads and pendants, cold hammered into simple shapes. In contrast, during the Hopewell period, carefully crafted plates appeared, sometimes cut into rich ornamentation, as well as more daring sculptures. Copper objects could be composed of several assembled pieces, resembling stylized representations of birds with curved wings or human hands with outstretched fingers. Some of these ornaments recall motifs present in what will later be called, in Mississippian times, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, which notably celebrates the figure of the falcon warrior and the celestial iconography of the lightning disk and the hand-eye. Although Hopewell directly precedes the great Mississippian tradition, these findings suggest that there was already a common mythological foundation whose roots would extend into later Native American beliefs. The role of animals is also fundamental in the religious and social concepts of the time. Archaeological discoveries reveal an attachment to the bear, often seen as a symbol of strength, healing, and cyclic rebirths. Hawks and other birds of prey, on the other hand, evoke the ability to travel between the sky and the earth, to carry prayers to the spirit realm, or guide the souls of the deceased. The wide repertoire of effigy pipes, pendants, and ornaments helps to understand that man is not alone at the center of the universe. He positions himself in a vast web where the natural world, ancestors, and deities intervene. Through a shamanism rooted in these interactions, society seeks to maintain balance, to ward off epidemics or famines, and to celebrate the renewal of the seasons. The trade nodes that support the Hopewell interaction sphere thus extend from the Gulf Coast to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and from the northern Great Lakes to the central part of the Mississippi Valley. Raw materials circulate along rivers and land routes, carried from community to community. Sometimes obsidian or copper changes hands several times before reaching their final destination, and each transaction or gift consolidates political and spiritual ties. The opportunities for exchange frequently blend with ceremonial gatherings where marriages, alliances, and peace pacts are negotiated. Religious and political leaders then take advantage of the aura conferred by exotic objects to enhance their prestige, ensuring the cohesion of a rural world fragmented into multiple scattered villages. Funerary mounds, effigies, and enclosure systems are sometimes reused or expanded over generations, leading to complex stratifications. On the same site, the base of a mound may date from the early Adena period, while the upper part, or the last burials, belong to a later Hopewell phase. Burial methods vary. For example, there are primary graves where the body is placed on the ground, covered with bark, and then buried under the earth, or secondary graves with previously cleaned bones. The objects buried with the deceased sometimes include effigy pipes, mica ornaments, clay figurines, and, more rarely, masks carved in copper or organic materials. The intent is to give the deceased access to everything they might need for their spiritual journey: ritual weapons, symbols of power, personal items reflecting their rank. Beyond the religious and artistic aspect, the period from around 1000 before Christ to 800 Anno Domini saw the development of new types of agricultural practices, although these societies still relied largely on hunting and gathering wild plants. The Ohio region was suitable for the pioneering cultivation of local species, such as the chenopodium, a seed-bearing herb, amaranth, and sunflower, which were already exploited by earlier populations. The ownership of cultivated land provided a certain degree of sedentarism, but mobility remained present, as maintaining exchange networks required groups to move around. Moreover, the different resources from one season to another could encourage temporary relocations to forest areas rich in game or to marshes teeming with birds. Excavations carried out in the early 20th century, later enriched by more recent research, have greatly transformed the understanding of the archaeology of the Ohio Valley. Pioneers such as American archaeologist Warren K. Moorhead conducted the first methodical investigations on certain major sites, albeit sometimes committing destructive excavations in line with the methods of the time. Recent scientific advances, notably in biological anthropology and isotope analysis, help better understand the social organization and diet of these communities. For example, it is discovered that the skeletons of some individuals show evidence of a relatively high consumption of cultivated plants, suggesting a diet close to horticulture, while others retain markers of hunter-gatherers. Leaders or high-ranking individuals seem to enjoy a more varied diet and regular access to animal proteins. These differences might reflect a more marked social stratification than in earlier communities, consistent with the existence of privileged graves and luxurious objects. Researchers are also interested in the pathologies found on bones to determine to what extent the considerable labor required for building mounds could impact health. Traces of physical stress, such as microfractures or lumbar pathologies, suggest that transporting and placing tons of earth were not without consequences. The fact that these monuments could have been constructed over several decades or expanded episodically indicates, nevertheless, a form of collective planning that went beyond a single project lasting a few months. Successive generations took up the project, completed it, transforming the local topography into a vast ritual landscape. The Adena Hopewell sacred landscapes were not limited to simple conical mounds or the serpent mound. In some areas, one finds alignments of posts, comparable to structures for celestial observation. Archaeologists have identified at sites like Newark earthworks in Ohio even more complex structures, a vast set of geometric enclosures with ditches and earthen embankments forming precise shapes, such as an octagon linked to a large circle. The study of these alignment systems suggests that they were designed to track the moon's path over several cycles, demonstrating a highly advanced astronomical knowledge. This celestial knowledge is combined with mythological inscriptions. The moon, the sun, and constellations could hold vital importance for marking the passage of seasons, predicting the germination of plants, or mapping out the calendar of rituals. Within these same enclosures, archaeologists often find traces of hearths, sometimes connected to deposits of ochre or assemblages of heated stones. It seems that purification rituals by fire or banquets, sharing seasonal hunting and gathering, were practiced there. The remains of animal bones, broken pottery, and fragmented ornaments are often gathered in pits, filled in at the end of the ceremony. This staging of fire, earth, and offerings, combined with the handling of exotic materials like obsidian, mica, and copper, likely gave the community a sense of participating in cults connecting several worlds, the nearby one of the forest and waterways, and the distant one of other peoples known through commercial alliances. In some graves or deposits, the spectacular aspect of the offerings always strikes the contemporary mind. One sees, for example, a dozen large-sized flint blades arranged in a fan shape behind the head of the deceased, as if it were a stylized raptor plumage. Sometimes, side by side, one also finds mica ornaments engraved with various animal silhouettes, ranging from bears to fish and including aquatic birds. The shimmering reflections of mica and obsidian, combined with the red color of pipestone and oxidized copper, must have produced a very strong visual effect when the tomb was opened for the burial rite, especially if the ceremony took place by the light of torches or crackling fires. Recent research in archaeoacoustics still questions the use of drums or whistles in these processions, possible elements to impress participants and reinforce the sacred dimension of the moment. During this long phase, lasting for some sites until the 5th or 6th century Anno Domini, the Hopewell tradition eventually began to decline, and there was a dispersion of ceremonial centers. Several hypotheses have been suggested to explain this transformation: climatic changes affecting wildlife and plant resources, the emergence of new forms of local power, or the rise of other competing traditions around the Mississippi Valley. Whatever the reasons, the architectural and artistic heritage of Adena and Hopewell remains crucial for understanding the origins of mound building in eastern North America and for studying the evolution of proto-historic trade networks. Around 1500 before Christ, the southwestern region of what is now the United States began to change significantly under the influence of a new agricultural practice. The introduction of corn, originating from the more southern regions of Mexico, gradually altered the lifestyles and social organization of communities previously focused mainly on hunting and gathering. The river valleys, notably those of the Gila and Salt, offer an environment conducive to irrigation, while the plateaus and semi-arid areas require more complex adaptation techniques. The arrival of this cereal, with its high nutritional potential, facilitated the sedentarization of groups that had previously practiced seasonal migrations to follow game and exploit various wild plants. By settling on stable sites, the populations began to develop a distinct cultural heritage, laying the foundations for traditions that would profoundly mark the region's history. Among these traditions, The basket maker culture first emerged, named for the many woven baskets found at archaeological sites. Its early phases occur shortly after the introduction of corn, when inhabitants began experimenting with real farming on small plots. Archaeological remains suggest that these early farmers still maintained, in parallel, a subsistence mode focused on hunting hares, deer, and gathering wild seeds. The presence of rock shelters, where remarkably preserved baskets are often found due to the arid environment, helps to understand their domestic organization. The tools made of bone, wood, and stone demonstrate a gradual adaptation to corn cultivation. Rudimentary hoes, scrapers for food preparation, projectile points for hunting. Over the centuries, these communities refined their storage techniques, notably by digging various dry or semi-buried pits intended for storing crops. The first villages remained modest, often consisting of semi-subterranean circular houses, grouped on small promontories or near ephemeral streams. The transition from the basket maker culture to what is today called the ancestral Pueblo culture resulted from both internal developments and exchanges with other groups. Milestones of this transition can be dated to around the beginning of our era, when maize production intensified and new varieties adapted to the short local growing season appeared. The ancestral Pueblo people gradually distinguished themselves with increasingly sophisticated architectural techniques, notably the use of stone blocks and mortar to build larger dwellings. Sites became denser, and community structures like kivas, semi-subterranean ceremonial rooms, began to be seen in the region's archaeology. These circular kivas, whose roofs are supported by wooden beams, presumably housed collective rituals centered on fertility, cosmology, and social cohesion. Researchers postulate that they played a role in pooling resources and redistributing agricultural production, becoming symbols of community identity. At the same time, the Mogollon settled further southeast, notably in present-day southern New Mexico and parts of Arizona. Their culture is distinct, although they share traits with their ancestral Pueblo and Hohokam neighbors. Agriculture also plays an important role here, with maize, beans, and squash-forming gardens near river tributaries, sometimes complemented by deer and rabbit hunting. The Mogollon is noted for their evolving pottery skills, leading to what is known as Mimbres production, particularly from around the 8th century Anno Domini. In these pottery pieces, often light-colored and adorned with black designs, various scenes are depicted: stylized animals, geometric shapes, and mythical representations. Archaeologists have found painted bowls featuring the motif of a man-deer, associating a human figure with deer-like attributes. This image might symbolize a shamanic transformation or a sacred connection to the environment. Although the Mogollon remained more dispersed and did not initially build large complexes, their exchange networks are evidenced by the circulation of ceramics, pigments, and stone tools, which sometimes traveled hundreds of kilometers. Meanwhile, at the heart of the arid valleys of central and southern Arizona, another agricultural culture flourished, the Hohokam. Starting around 300 before Christ, and according to some specialists, perhaps earlier, these groups developed highly elaborate irrigation systems along the Gila and Salt rivers. They dug canals that meandered for miles, allowing controlled distribution of water to fields of maize, squash, and beans. This hydraulic engineering required significant collective organization, involving public works planning, regular maintenance of the canals, and distribution of water based on the needs of each sector. The Hohokam also built basins to retain and store water during seasonal droughts. Rudimentary measuring techniques likely allowed them to manage the flow within the canals, optimizing harvests and supporting a growing population. One of the distinctive features of the Hohokam world is the presence of ball courts, oval playing spaces also found in Mesoamerica, where ball games held sacred and symbolic significance. The discovery of these structures at Hohokam sites such as Snaketown suggests a possible cultural link with northern Mexico, or at least exchanges of ideas about ceremonial practices. These courts, sometimes surrounded by embankments, measure several tens of meters in length and may have been used for fertility or social cohesion rituals. It is also possible that valuable items, such as shell jewelry or turquoise objects, circulated during festive gatherings. Archaeology reveals that macaws, tropical-related birds, were found at Hohokam sites, further evidence of distant contacts with other regions of the continent. From the early centuries of our era, the ancestral Pueblo communities settled further north, in what would later become northern Arizona, southern Utah, Colorado, and northern New Mexico, began to erect constructions that would expand over the centuries. Chaco Canyon, located in what is now northwestern New Mexico, became a major center between the 9th and 12th centuries. Large stone great houses were built there, with Pueblo Bonito being the most famous example, consisting of several hundred rooms arranged over multiple stories. A thoughtful urbanism is evident. Astronomical alignments indicate an excellent knowledge of the sky, and sacred roads, sometimes 9 meters wide, radiated from Chaco Canyon to other regional sites. These roads, meticulously traced, may have had a ritual dimension, linking sacred places and allowing the transport of various goods, such as fine pottery, semi-precious stones, copper, or shell ornaments from the Gulf of California. Further west and north, in what is now Colorado, the Mesa Verde region is home to impressive troglodytic complexes. Between the 12th and 13th centuries of our era, several ancestral Pueblo communities built their homes beneath cliffs, using natural alcoves to protect from the harsh climate. The most famous of these complexes, like Cliff Palace, include dozens of rooms and circular kivas, all accessible by ladders or small paths, carved into the stone. The constructions take advantage of the shelter provided by the cliff, thus preserving warmth in the winter and offering refreshing shade in the summer. Nearby, there are also remnants of terrace farming. The production of decorated pottery and the use of corn, beans, and squash indicate a permanent agriculture, supported by the capture of runoff water. Despite the apparent isolation, pieces of turquoise, shell, and copper, transported from distant lands, confirm Mesa Verde's participation in a regional exchange network. In southern New Mexico, Mimbres pottery, associated with the Mogollon culture branch, reached a distinctive refinement between the 8th and 12th centuries. Numerous bowls and vessels reveal black motifs painted on a white or cream background, depicting humans, animals, or mythical entities. The partially naturalistic scenes sometimes show hunting gestures, ceremonies, or metamorphoses, like the so-called deer man figure. This was likely a central part of their beliefs, linking the community to a spiritual world where humans connect with animal and plant energies. Many of these bowls were buried with the deceased, sometimes perforated at the bottom, possibly to release the spirit of the deceased or to mark the passage to another plane. Moreover, relatively small village structures with kivas, central plazas, or storage areas prove a strong community life and social organization centered around collective survival. In general, interregional exchanges seem to have been particularly developed among the different groups of the Southwest. There are stylistic similarities in pottery, influences in the construction of great ceremonial halls, and exotic objects traveling over long distances. Shells from the Gulf of California, shaped into bracelets, necklaces, or pendants, are found in many ancestral Pueblo, Mogollon, or Hohokam sites. The turquoise extracted from local deposits, or imported, is valued in the making of pendants and inlays. Discoveries of hammered copper objects, supposedly of Mesoamerican origin, illustrate the mutual curiosity and the need to maintain peaceful relations to ensure the circulation of goods considered to have high social or spiritual value. At the turn of the 13th century, the prosperity and demographic growth of the ancestral Pueblo communities, as well as some of the Mogollon, are challenged by difficult climatic events. Between 1275 and 1300, a mega drought hits the southwest, drastically reducing water reserves, affecting stream flow, and compromising by an increased variability of rainfall. The irrigation canals among the Hohokam become more difficult to maintain, maize yields drop, and wildlife resources decline in already heavily exploited areas. Some tree ring analyses indeed indicate a significant drop in precipitation and a scarcity of water available for agriculture. Tensions between neighboring groups may have intensified in this context, although not all regions experienced the same evolution. In Chaco Canyon, a decline is already being observed for several decades, possibly linked to earlier climatic changes or to the over-exploitation of wood resources. Mesa Verde, further north, is experiencing a progressive abandonment as inhabitants leave the cliff villages and migrate south or east, following routes leading to the Rio Grande Valley or sometimes further to other territories offering better agricultural conditions. It was long assumed that these migrations were made under military pressure from some opposing populations, or that they responded solely to the lack of water and arable land. Current research nuances these hypotheses, showing that cultural, religious, and political factors could have influenced the decision to emigrate, as well as the search for new alliances. In the Rio Grande Valley, we see the appearance or enlargement of pueblos, where many ancestral Pueblo families take refuge at the end of the 13th century. These establishments develop large central plazas, collective kivas, and dwellings grouped in more compact blocks, both to share resources and to protect against possible external incursions. Construction techniques evolve, with some communities adopting adobe walls or effectively using sun-dried bricks, while dry stone architecture remains widespread in areas where the mineral resource is abundant. Agricultural ceremonies, centered on the veneration of deities linked to rain and fertility, continue and transform, sometimes incorporating elements inherited from Chacoan and Mogollon traditions. The Hohokam, hitherto focused on maintaining their complex canal systems, also seem to suffer the effects of this mega-drought. Several major sites, such as Snaketown, see their populations decrease. Possible irregular seasonal floods, combined with years of extreme aridity, exacerbate irrigation difficulties. Ball courts that had flourished in these centers may lose their ceremonial role or change function, while the kiva, a structure typically anchored among the ancestral Pueblo, was not a central element among the Hohokam. Some sites persist, nevertheless, sometimes by reducing their size or by redirecting their productions towards other resources, such as hunting or wild plant gathering. In the event of a prolonged degradation of climatic conditions, many inhabitants most likely depart to join more clement regions or integrate into neighboring communities. Among the Mogollon, the Mimbres region is also affected, although archaeological studies show a slightly more prolonged abandonment and decline over time, after the period of great pottery creativity. Villages lose population, several are deserted, and Mimbres ceramic production fades in the archives. The reorganization of these societies in the face of drought likely involves a more marked return to seasonal mobility, a stronger reliance on hunting, or migration to wetter areas. Here, too, the possibility of alliances with neighboring cultures cannot be ruled out. Ceramic motifs or construction techniques may then be shared, modified, and incorporated into new mixed traditions, testifying to the cultural plasticity at work. As drought takes hold and displacements increase, the sacred roads traced from Chaco or the long-distance exchanges that once united various communities seem to lose their vigor. The major centers are depopulating, even though some traditions persist within newly fortified pueblos. Kivas continue to be dug and used for community rites, passing on to new generations an ancestral knowledge that values balance with natural elements. All of this reflects the persistence of a spiritual life strong enough to maintain a cultural link between ancient times and ongoing evolutions. Agricultural engineering continues, but often in other forms, sometimes less ambitious, refocused on the most reliable rivers or on techniques that allow rainwater to be collected at the foot of mesas. Small local canals, easier to maintain, supplant long and demanding networks unless they are permanently abandoned. The gathering around the Rio Grande, the tributaries of the Little Colorado, or in some more favorable valleys, attracts many families who organize according to clan and familial rules, still poorly understood in all their complexity by archaeology. Alliances are formed to collectively manage the new installations, dig reservoirs, build retaining walls, or establish defense systems. The landscapes transform, marked by the proliferation of terraced fields, small dams, and family horticultural enterprises. Lifestyles are reinvented within cultural identities that, starting from distinct cultures, basket maker, ancestral Pueblo, Mogollon, or Hohokam, eventually merge into the emergence of late Pueblo communities, with hybrid traditions open to cross-influences. Between 3000 before Christ and 1500 Anno Domini, the Pacific Northwest region and the vast North American Arctic saw the emergence of complex societies closely linked to the maritime environment. At this time, local populations developed subsistence strategies based on the intensive exploitation of marine resources, particularly salmon, a fish abundant in coastal rivers and streams. The seasonal migrations of these salmon schools, annually swimming upstream to spawn, provided a highly nutritious food source that could be dried, smoked, or stored for the harsher months. Thanks to this predictable reproductive cycle, several communities quickly adopted semi-sedentary lifestyles, setting up their homes near fishing sites. The red cedar, an emblematic tree of the Pacific Coast's wet forests, had a considerable impact on the cultural and logistical development of these populations. Its wood, renowned for its resistance and durability, was used for the construction of houses, totems, and canoes, thus strengthening the connection between economic activities and the spiritual universe of these groups. The humid and temperate climate of the coastal zone also provided a diversity of plant and animal resources, ranging from mollusks and crustaceans found in estuaries to the vast coniferous forests. The coastal peoples were thus able to accumulate food surpluses and free up time for artisanal, religious, and political activities. This abundance provided the foundation for the potlatch, a redistribution ceremony central to social life. The potlatch, celebrated on various occasions such as weddings, deaths, or the accession to a chief status, served to reinforce internal hierarchies while ensuring group cohesion. During these large gatherings, chiefs and notables offered costly gifts to their guests, expressing their status while consolidating a network of mutual obligations. The resources distributed included woven blankets, foodstuffs, ritual objects, and prestigious crafts. A host's prestige was sometimes measured by the volume given or destroyed, which revealed his capacity to generate wealth and highlighted the crucial value of generosity in these communities. Within these coastal societies, a distinct artistic style called formline emerged. It is characterized by flowing contours and intertwined geometric shapes, often painted or engraved on wood, copper, or textiles. This artistic expression was developed by several nations, including the Haida, primarily residing in the Haida-Gwaii archipelago, and the Tlingit, occupying an area from southeastern Alaska to parts of northwestern Canada. Totem poles carved from red cedar, sometimes as tall as multi-story buildings, embodied the stories of family lineages, clans, and mythological figures while connecting the earthly world to guardian spirits. Some totems depicted the adventures of animal deities, such as the raven or the bear, figures often associated with the creation of the world or other initiatory legends. Notable families erected these carved columns in front of their homes, thus asserting their ancestry, marital alliances, and their role in the community. Among the Tlingit, the art of transformable masks also illustrates their talent for producing spectacular pieces, with mechanisms allowing certain parts of the carved face to open or close, sometimes revealing a hidden animal form. These objects, used during rituals, ceremonial dances, or potlatch, strengthened the bonds among members of the same clan and offered a theatrical dimension to religious practices. Transformable masks could represent half-human, half-animal creatures, highlighting the importance of transformation and the role of spirits in daily life. Holes made for eyes, mouth, and joints allowed the dancer to manipulate the mask's structure, giving the impression that the represented creature came to life under the audience's gaze. Alongside these artistic productions, architecture remained a major identity marker. In the coastal area, single-gabled plank houses sometimes lined up in rows, offering a spacious shelter capable of housing several extended families. These dwellings, constructed primarily from large cedar planks, could measure 10 to 20 meters in length and featured a central hearth around which relatives gathered during periods of extreme cold. The choice of a ridge opening served to let the smoke from cooking and heating fires escape. Doors often adorned with carved or painted effigies extended the symbolic system of the house, marking the passage between the material world and that of ancestors or guardian deities. The interior structures were also compartmentalized, reflecting to some extent the social stratification in place. Noble families occupied larger and better decorated spaces, while commoners were relegated to collective quarters. In rare cases, slaves, stemming from raids on nearby or distant populations, lived confined to less visible sectors. Social hierarchy was most often based on belonging to a prestigious clan or lineage. The chiefs, from noble families, held political and religious authority, settling internal conflicts, deciding on trade relations, and overseeing rituals. More numerous, the commoners contributed to harvest, fish processing, cedar exploitation, and various craft works. Slaves, who could be acquired during war expeditions, performed the most arduous tasks and were considered as exchangeable goods or offered during potlatch. This pyramidal structure was maintained through strategic marital alliances and public rituals where distinctions between groups were reaffirmed. The possession of unique items like rare masks, tunics adorned with mother-of-pearl buttons, or command staffs engraved in cedar also helped establish the notoriety of certain chiefs. Potlatches thus constituted a privileged scene for displaying the power and influence of a house while creating a socio-economic balance within the community. To the north of this coastal area, the North American Arctic region underwent a significant transformation, starting around 1000 Anno Domini with the arrival of the Thule. Before their arrival, other Paleo-Eskimo cultures, sometimes grouped under the term Dorset Complex or other regional names, already occupied the frozen lands of the far north, living off hunting primarily focused on seals, caribou, polar bears, and marine mammals. The Thule, originating from the coastal regions of Alaska, brought a series of innovations that allowed them to rapidly expand eastward, reaching as far as Greenland. Their lifestyle, adapted to extreme conditions, involved the use of lightweight and maneuverable boats such as the kayak, made from skins stretched over a frame of wood or bone. This single-seater boat facilitated hunting marine mammals and ensured great mobility along the ice floes. The arch-built sled, also known as a rigid runner sled, pulled by dogs specially trained to cover long distances on ice, provided an unparalleled means of transport in these polar conditions, allowing the transport of people, provisions, and materials across hostile territories. The ulu, a crescent-shaped knife with a broad blade, was of great importance in domestic life and food preparation among the Thule. Designed to easily cut meat, fish, or skins, this tool was characterized by a handle fixed on the upper part of the blade, simplifying the task of skinning. Women, keepers of the technique for making and repairing skin clothing, also used the ulu to tailor warm garments suited to harsh winters. Parkas made from caribou or seal fur provided essential thermal insulation. This clothing expertise, coupled with the advantages of the kayak and sled, enabled the Thule to inhabit areas where survival year-round was previously challenging. The camps of these populations sometimes consisted of semi-subterranean huts, constructed from stone and whalebone, covered with stretched skins and sods. This winter-type igloo dwelling offered better heat retention, enabling families to withstand prolonged snowstorms. For the Thule, whaling was of considerable importance, especially in regions of Alaska and the western Canadian Arctic. Organizing this activity mobilized large teams and required larger collective boats like the Umiak, able to accommodate several hunters. Humpback and bowhead whales were prey requiring the implementation of a coordinated strategy. Hunters had to spot a cetacean, pursue it, and then hit it with harpoons fitted with sealskin floats, so the animal, exhausted, would eventually become immobilized and sink slowly. Once the prey was brought ashore, the meat, fat, skin, and bones were distributed among different family units or used in ritual contexts. The prosperity of these groups thus depended on their ability to cooperate during these complex hunts while mastering technical knowledge passed down from generation to generation. The demographic push and logistical ingenuity of the Thule partly explain their gradual expansion. In less than 3 centuries, they traveled thousands of kilometers across the Arctic, supplanting or integrating established Paleo-Eskimo groups. Archaeological sites, such as those found in the Davis Strait region in Nunavut, show assemblages of bone and stone tools that illustrate the transition from a subsistence economy mostly focused on seals to a broader focus including whales and other marine mammals. Ice flow hunting techniques, complemented by ice fishing, remained essential in the most extreme areas, where vegetation is scarce and temperatures drop well below zero for most of the year. The Thule also developed great flexibility in their installations, changing locations based on animal migrations and the formation of ice sheets. Small communities could split up, explore new territories, and then reform around festive events or large hunting projects. Between 1000 before Christ and 1500 Anno Domini, the vast territories of the Great Plains and Prairies of North America comprised an immense expanse, composed of grassy plains, river valleys, and some moderate elevations. In this large area, roughly located between the Rocky Mountains to the west and denser forests to the east, countless human groups lived by hunting and gathering before the horse made its appearance. The climate, often marked by large temperature variations and long periods of drought, shaped the way of life of the communities. Winters could be harsh, while summers, hot and sometimes stormy, maintained prairies suited to the growth of short grasses, favorable to the bison. This vast grassy area served as a giant pantry, as herds of these large herbivores moved in seasonal quests for pasture. At the time in question, there was not yet the widespread diffusion of the horse, which was imported much later from Eurasia by Europeans. Consequently, hunting and moving strategies were adapted to the intensive use of the dog as the primary draft animal. Agriculture existed in some favorable areas, particularly along major rivers, where the less dry soils could support the cultivation of maize varieties resistant to local conditions. In this environment, itinerancy and sedentariness combined with the seasons, with population dispersals around hunting sites and more stable gatherings along waterways. The great bison jumps became fundamental elements of subsistence in several regions, and one of the most famous is undoubtedly Head Smashed Inn, located in the present-day province of Alberta, Canada. There, groups of hunters organized large-scale operations to drive or lure bison towards a rocky escarpment. The animals, like gigantic herds, were driven to gallop en masse, eventually falling off the cliff. Below, systematic butchering took place. Skins, meat, and even bones were utilized. The geographical conditions of this place were particularly suitable due to an adequate wind that concealed human scent from the bison and a downhill terrain that facilitated the charge towards the precipice. Such collective hunts required meticulous organization. Sometimes stones were arranged in circles or small walls to channel the herd's movement. Hunters, armed with spears, bows, or simple torches to frighten the herd, slowly pushed the herd in a specific direction. These practices required a fine understanding of animal behavior, as well as coordination of all participants, from scouts to the men and women downstream who handled the carcasses. In other segments of these plains, there were fairly mobile camps, often seasonal, which developed near these bison jumps, or on sites with an abundance of natural resources. The tents, mostly made of sewn bison hides, were erected quickly and remained functional even in strong winds or drizzles. The peoples lived in small family bands, gathering in larger groups only during great hunts or ritual ceremonies. In these contexts, the dog played a major role. It pulled a travois, a sort of rudimentary sled made of two long poles attached to the animal's neck or sides, with a platform at the back for transporting skins, utensils, or young children. Although the maximum load remained modest, this simple technology expanded the capacity of these populations to move from one place to another, especially when following bison herds or searching for new pastures for gathering wild plants. Before the arrival of the horse, this means constituted the main logistical asset, also allowing for rapid evacuation of a camp in case of alert or sudden weather change. In the Missouri River corridor, sedentary farming cultures took a different form. The Mandan and Araucarian groups, today recognized as two historically distinct but culturally related peoples, built true fortified villages, sometimes equipped with mounds, meaning artificially raised earth mounds serving as platforms or protections. One reason for establishing these sites near the Missouri was the presence of a fertile floodplain, ideal for cultivating a variety of corn known as northern flint. This cultivar, adapted to shorter growing seasons, withstood the sometimes harsh climate of the northern plains. Thus, these communities could store significant quantities of grain throughout the year. They supplemented their diet with hunting and fishing, and maintained a network of exchanges with nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. The Mandan, mostly settled in the upper Missouri region, built earthen dwellings, often round or slightly oval, with roofs supported by wooden poles. The structures, quite spacious, provided effective shelter against the icy winter winds. The ditches and palisades erected around these fortified villages testified to recurring conflicts over access to resources. The Arikara, sometimes referred to as Ri in older texts, developed similar strategies, and temporary alliances could form between them and other groups to defend a territory or trade, particularly surplus corn. Toward the end of the period, before the wider expansion of horse use, mobility remained considerably influenced by the environment and a social organization where cooperation was crucial. In the Great Plains, with metal deposits or specific quarries, certain highly prized mineral resources were found. Catlinite, a relatively soft reddish stone, was located in what is now Minnesota. Communities sought it out to carve ceremonial pipes, often referred to as calumets. The pipes fashioned from this rock, sometimes thin and elongated, sometimes more massive, played an essential role in diplomatic negotiations and spiritual rituals. The smoke that escaped from them during ceremonies often symbolized prayer, the word exchanged with the spirit world, or the sacred seal of an alliance. The trade of catlinite thus traversed great distances, as archaeological finds show pipes made from this stone up to the western edge of the Rockies, even in areas further east. Their significance transcended mere material function, linking various groups through shared ceremonies, a central element of intertribal cohesion. In the same vein, the exchange of northern flint corn between sedentary populations and more mobile groups was established as soon as the latter passed near villages during their seasonal movements. They often left with sacks of grain and could offer in return dried bison or hides. The Mandan and Arikara were thus recognized for their ability to accumulate agricultural surpluses, a prerequisite for creating denser community centers. This evolution, initiated over the long term, also marked a differentiation in lifestyles. On one side, sedentary villages with food reserves and durable installations. On the other, hunter-gatherers specialized in seeking herds. Yet even these so-called sedentary societies retained a certain flexibility. When local resources became too scarce, or when an external threat emerged, they could relocate part of the population to other strategic sites, always along watercourses. The earthen structures could be abandoned, then rebuilt elsewhere. This flexibility in settlement translated a technical know-how inherited from centuries of adaptation, in addition to an excellent understanding of nature and its cycles. Another central aspect of the material culture of these communities remained the use of tools made from flint or polished stone. On the Great Plains, the absence of large deposits of quality flint or chert pushed some populations to move further to obtain appropriate materials. Archaeological traces reveal that flint from Wyoming or Dakota was used to craft projectile points, knives, and other instruments intended for hunting and preparing skins. Meanwhile, buffalo vertebrae could be transformed into scrapers, and tendons were also used to make robust threads capable of sewing or reinforcing the poles of a travois. The peoples closely adapted to available resources, deriving from buffalo meat, bones, horns, and skin, almost everything they needed. The surplus meat, especially if the hunt had been fruitful, could be smoked or dried and then stored for several months, allowing survival through winters. Archaeologists sometimes find, at ancient campsite sites, drying areas where bone residues and butchering tools accumulated, as well as light wooden structures used to hang the meat. Although intertribal diplomacy was often ensured through barter and the sharing of resources, conflicts were present, sometimes due to reasons of hunting territory or access to the best agricultural lands. Mound villages, with their ditches and ramparts, indicate a constant fear of surprise attacks. The Mandan, for example, raised watch platforms or erected enclosures of wood and compact earth. Sentinels stood guard, immediately alerting the population in case of suspicious movement. Archaeological analyses of skeletons also reveal traces of wounds received during close combat or sieges. In these crucial moments, the use of the calumet could also intervene to try to ease tensions. Its ritual and symbolic role went beyond the mere smoking instrument. It sealed peace treaties or consolidated temporary truces. Conducting a joint ceremony before and after a strategic conflict strengthened a form of warrior protocol while delivering a spiritual message to all participants. Over the centuries, between 1000 before Christ and 1500 Anno Domini, a gradual evolution of cultural practices is observed. The first communities, which focused mainly on hunting and gathering, began to establish the beginnings of agriculture, especially when they set up their camps near waterways. This transition was also due to the progressive improvement of a maize capable of germinating, growing, and fruiting quickly during the warm season. The northern Flint variety is a notable example. Its smaller ears compared to current varieties were nonetheless rich in nutrients. Harvests represented a reliable caloric base, more stable than the irregular availability caused by animal migrations. The Mandan and Arikara perfected these skills, implementing rudimentary irrigation ditches or exploiting seasonal floods to nourish the fields. Simultaneously, local craftsmanship experienced a notable boom, including the production of pottery used for cooking and storage. The incised decorations on ceramics sometimes depicted grand hunting scenes or abstract motifs related to the fertility of the land. In this pre-equestrian phase, interaction between neighboring communities could stimulate innovation, with some nomadic groups sporadically adopting maize cultivation to supplement their diet. Each autumn, when the bison began their migrations to escape the first chills, the hunters prepared to leave their village or summer camp. At sites like Head Smashed In, sequences of occupation sometimes lasted several weeks, enough time to prepare the trapping, scout the herds, and gather the manpower needed for the operation. Families came with their packed dogs to set up small circular tents. The children helped gather dead wood to fuel the fires, while the elders prepared the rituals intended to secure the protection of the spirits. The women handled much of the meat processing, skinning, slicing, and hanging to dry. The men, for their part, coordinated to drive the cattle, raise stone barriers, and scare the animals at the agreed time. In some oral traditions, there is mention of calls or dances intended to disrupt the vigilance of the bison, using instruments made of bone and horns. When the herd rushed towards the void, the sound of the gallop and the bellows echoed across the cliff. After the fall, several days were sometimes spent cutting everything up. The hides were used to make robes, blankets, and other everyday items. The meat, once processed, could be consumed immediately or converted into pemmican, a highly nutritious and easily transportable mixture of fat, dried meat, and berries. The Mandan, nestled along the Missouri, were a more advanced example of sedentism. They could cope with annual floods that naturally fertilized their plots with silt. They also conducted fishing activities both in the river and in nearby ponds. The fish, wrapped in leaves or clay mud, were grilled over wood embers. At the same time, they maintained rudimentary orchards and fields, where several varieties of vegetables, like beans or squash, sometimes grew, introduced to the region through exchange routes extending to the south and east. The Arikara, established further south, adopted similar strategies, sometimes distinguished by slight variations in pottery, embroidery patterns on their clothing, or the architecture of their communal lodges. The mound villages could include a larger dwelling, located at the top of a mound, reserved for councils or important ceremonies. It was not uncommon to hold political meetings there to decide on the future direction of the tribe, allocate agricultural tasks, and settle disputes. In these meetings, the Catlinite pipe played a significant symbolic role, passed from one dignitary to another to seal decisions, pray, or celebrate alliances. Many oral accounts testify to the prestige associated with owning pipes carved from catlinite. Some individuals undertook long journeys to obtain the red rock at its source in the Pipestone region, where a protected site still exists today. Extracting the stone required time and appropriate tools. It was also believed that the site remained under the guardianship of ancestral spirits, making it necessary to perform rituals to ask for permission to harvest the material. The pipes underwent careful polishing, and decorations were sometimes engraved on them, depicting a bison, a bird of prey, geometric patterns, or celestial symbols. In a diplomatic context, presenting a pipe to a guest amounted to welcoming them into the sacred circle, signifying an intention of peace or hospitality. Smoking together represented the conclusion of the pact. The European explorers, who arrived much later, were astonished by the importance attached to these objects and the solemnity surrounding their use. Devoid of monetary stake in the Western sense, these pipes held invaluable importance in the construction and perpetuation of tribal identities. Without ever being consciously formalized as a legal code, the use of the pipe could mediate conflicts, seal marriages, or consecrate a new religious alliance. The perpetual movements of nomadic bands and the more stable presence of fortified villages ultimately enriched the cultural fabric of these Great Plains. It is said that when an itinerant group arrived near a Mandan or Arikara village, a system of visual signaling sometimes allowed them to communicate from a distance using smoke signals, mirrors made of polished surfaces, or runners sent by foot, always more belatedly, because until the late 15th century, the presence of horses remained extremely rare. Until then, one could rely on the speed of a foot messenger or the use of dogs able to cover long distances. Initial contacts often led to a reception under the community's large house, where a feast could be organized with boiled corn, grilled or dried bison meat, and, if the season permitted, plains fruits like buffalo berries. Exchanges involved all sorts of objects: tools, tanned hides, mineral pigments for painting, and even ornaments made from rare bird feathers. These festive gatherings also provided an opportunity to share news, anecdotes about recent hunts, and mythological tales recounting the intervention of supernatural beings in daily life. The whole consolidated an extensive cultural network, maintained by numerous intermediaries. Amidst this complex ballet, the ultimate pivot remained the key resource, the bison. Before the introduction of the horse, the killing of these massive beasts required fine strategies and the ability to take advantage of the landscape. Techniques varied by region, but the end goal remained the same: harvesting what could feed the community, clothe its members, and fuel ritual activities. The bison was recognized as having a fundamental place in cosmology. Its strength and perseverance held sacred dimensions, making it a totem animal in several spiritual traditions. Inside the circular lodges, important bones like the skull or spine of the bison were sometimes kept for use in ceremonies associated with fertility, health, or hunting. Elders would tell how, at the beginning of time, the bison taught man the secrets of fire and survival on these vast plains. In a culture closely tied to natural cycles, the protection of herds was allied with the necessity of hunting. Without balance between the two, the community's survival risked being compromised. Around 800 Anno Domini, in the vast Mississippi Valley, an unprecedented socio-political configuration emerged, grouping different communities into a hierarchical and highly ritualized entity. These populations, often referred to as Mississippians, developed large ceremonial and urban centers, the most notable being Cahokia, in what is now the state of Illinois near the Mississippi River. At that time, the surrounding landscapes possessed remarkable fertility, offering rich soils and easy access to waterways essential for trade and travel. Alongside this, agricultural innovations based on corn, squash, and beans, commonly known as the Three Sisters, encouraged greater settlement and the consolidation of centralized political and religious powers. Leaders, sometimes revered as semi-divine figures, reigned from elevated structures where complex ceremonies took place. Over the decades, urban planning refined, palisades were erected around major centers, and trade networks multiplied, connecting coastal areas, central plains, and Appalachian foothills. From a ritual perspective, the social hierarchy was supported by sacred rites and elaborate enactments, marked by collective processions and symbolic offerings. From this effervescence arose the largest demographic and architectural concentration on the continent north of Mexico. Located on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, Cahokia was the pivot of this civilizational momentum. Since its beginnings around the 9th century, the city expanded to cover an estimated area of more than 13 square kilometers. At its peak, perhaps around the year 1150, the population may have exceeded 20,000 individuals, a considerable number for a pre-Columbian locality north of Mexico. Its urban organization included a network of plazas, inhabited sidelines, and ceremonial spaces structured around monumental mounds. The most imposing, Monk's Mound, rose more than 30 meters high and covered nearly 5.3 hectares, making it one of the largest earthen structures ever built by pre-Hispanic American societies. On its successive terraces, there were platforms intended for ceremonies, the residences of the elite, and political management. A vast ditch, accompanied by a wooden palisade, traced a symbolic boundary between the sacred space and the outside world. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of repeated reconstructions of this barrier, indicating a constant care to preserve the distinction between the ritual center and the surrounding residential areas. This precise arrangement reflected the extent of administrative and religious authority that regulated the creation of infrastructure and the flow of agricultural, artisanal, and commercial resources. At the heart of Cahokia, the alignment of enigmatic post circles named Woodhenge illustrates the astronomical and ritual complexity characterizing this society. Discovered through excavations in the latter half of the 20th century, this ensemble of large wooden posts, arranged in several concentric circles, probably served as a solar observatory, allowing the marking of solstices, equinoxes, and other crucial calendrical points. At key moments of the year, the elite and the populace gathered to conduct ceremonies, perhaps related to crop fertility, cosmic renewal, or the symbolic maintenance of the leader's power. The posts, carefully installed at precise distances, composed an impressive device that attested to these builders' ability to combine astronomical knowledge, measurement techniques, and a sense of the sacred. The dimensions vary according to the circles, but the largest could be nearly 125 meters in diameter, demonstrating the scope of the planning required. The exact location of Woodhenge, near the main mound and a ceremonial esplanade, underscores its role in Cahokia's ritual and political life, uniting cosmic cycles and social life. This device, unique in North America, was probably essential for organizing the agricultural calendar, synchronizing community activities, and enhancing the prestige of the leaders. Within this civilization developed a vast symbolic system, later known as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, abbreviated SECC. Although the expression was coined by modern researchers, it reflects the reality of religious and artistic exchanges linking different Mississippian centers. Among the most evocative representations is the falcon warrior, a central element whose iconography presents a hybrid character, half man, half bird of prey, evoking military power and cosmic intercession. The hand-eye, often engraved on prestige objects or painted on ceramics, symbolizes a passage between the earthly world and the upper planes, suggesting a link between human action and divine energies. The lightning disk, associated with the power of storms, materializes the fertility of the lands and the leader's ability to master elements vital for collective survival. These motifs appeared on various supports, such as copper ornaments, engraved marine shells, and certain polished stone blades. The objects, often redistributed during prestige ceremonies, maintain political cohesion and belief in a central legitimate power, guardian of community prosperity. Through the diffusion of this ritual complex, affiliated societies anchored themselves in a common imaginary, cementing both their commercial alliances and their religious ideals. The Mississippian area comprised a complex network of city-states and satellite villages spread over a vast territory, from the Ohio Valley to the Gulf Coast, and extending westward to the Great Plains. Archaeological remains reveal the circulation of exotic objects, such as copper from the Great Lakes region, mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from the Rockies, and some shell beads from the Atlantic coasts. Besides raw materials, we also find evidence of the diffusion of ceramic styles, construction techniques, and common ritual motifs. The elites of each center maintained these flows to consolidate their authority, supporting a system of gift and countergift that ensured the loyalty of more distant vassals. Offerings, sometimes deposited in prestige burials, constituted tangible symbols of interconnection among groups identifying with the Mississippian complex. On some sites, the presence of large plazas and fortified enclosures also indicates the desire to territorially mark the influence of powerful, dominant lineages. A striking example lies in the discovery of elaborate jewelry and ceremonial pipes made of catlinite, a material extracted from quarries in present-day Minnesota, traveling over thousands of kilometers. Thus, a true provincial network was woven, bound by beliefs, exchanges, and ritual diplomacy. Despite the splendor of these major centers, Mississippian life also experienced its share of internal tensions and succession rivalries. Archaeological discoveries show that some communities fortified their sites, sometimes with multiple levels of palisades and watch platforms, a sign of frequent fear of attacks. Within Cahokia itself, different neighborhoods suggest distinctly marked social divisions, where access to prestige goods and resources was not equal for all. The troubling anecdote of the sudden burning of a settlement of about 20 hectares, explained by some specialists as a dynastic quarrel, bears witness to episodes of collective violence. Deposits of charcoal and signs of hasty reconstructions indicate that this event, dated several centuries after the initial establishment of the city, illustrates a profound moment of crisis. The hierarchical organization, carried by a sacred elite, did not prevent the emergence of local factions determined to challenge the established order. Hypotheses oscillate between an act of rebellion against a ruling lineage and a conflict between two competing lineages for control of the region. In some burial mounds, graves apparently linked to mass executions have even been unearthed, reminding that power could be coercive and that Mississippian society was not necessarily pacified at all times. Between the 13th and 14th centuries, several combined factors contributed to the gradual decline of the great Mississippian centers. Climatic fluctuations, including periods of severe drought or torrential rains, occurred at a time when demographic pressure led to intensive agriculture. The soils, overexploited, began to deplete, reducing food production and weakening social cohesion. At the same time, the rise of new ruling clans in peripheral areas reduced central influence, forcing some major sites to further strengthen their defenses. Competition for access to raw material deposits or arable land eventually exacerbated conflicts, weakening the sacred image of the elites. Population movements, prompted by these upheavals, altered the political map of the Mississippi Valley. Many inhabitants left Cahokia and other comparable cities to regroup in less exposed villages closer to stable resources. The rituals related to the southeastern ceremonial complex did not disappear immediately, but fragmented and evolved under the impetus of emerging new traditions. Some groups maintained certain symbols, like the hand-eye or the falcon warrior, while adding local peculiarities. By 1500, many areas previously integrated into major chiefdoms functioned more autonomously, signaling major transformations in the political balance before the arrival of Europeans. Around the year 1000 Anno Domini, the vast region stretching from the northeast of what would become North America to the shores of the Great Lakes experienced significant cultural and agricultural transformations. Among these developments, the increasing adoption of the agricultural trio, dubbed the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, revolutionized the subsistence modes of many communities settled on these fertile lands. Prior to this period, some groups still largely depended on hunting, fishing, and gathering wild resources such as nuts and berries, although they had already begun to cultivate various domesticated plants. With the emergence of the vegetable triad, villages grew in size and stability, promoting the rise of more sedentary communities. The concept of the Three Sisters is based on a principle of intercropping, where each plant contributes to the growth and protection of the others. The sturdy stalks of corn serve as support for climbing beans, which fix nitrogen in the soil, while the broad leaves of the squash cover the ground to retain moisture and repel weeds. This ingenious approach significantly improves the fertility of the field, optimizes space, and supports the dietary needs of populations who derive proteins, complex carbohydrates, and vitamins from these various crops. This technique enabled many groups established around Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and Lake Huron to strengthen their food security. In parallel with this agricultural revolution, the ingenuity of these peoples was manifested in the design of the birch bark canoe, especially using birch. The northern forests of the region provided abundant resources of wood and bark, suitable for various uses. The construction of a lightweight and durable canoe offered a major advantage for navigating the countless rivers, lakes, and waterways winding through the northeast. The birch bark canoe, assembled from sewn pieces and caulked with resin, allowed the transport of people, goods, and sometimes entire families over long distances. Thanks to this innovation, commercial, diplomatic, and cultural exchanges could extend and consolidate over larger territories. During the same period, several indigenous nations of the Northeast observed the enrichment of their existence thanks to agricultural surpluses. When harvests were bountiful, inhabitants could develop more elaborate crafts, dedicate more time to building ceremonial structures, and strengthen their diplomatic ties, with neighboring communities. Large annual gatherings allowed chiefs, shamans, and keepers of traditions, sometimes called sachems, to exchange on political and spiritual realities. The social fabric was thus reinforced, while agricultural prosperity encouraged demographic stability. Temporary peace agreements would sometimes seal collaboration between villages, laying the foundations for larger organizations intended to transcend tribal rivalries. One of the major milestones in the history of these groups was the founding of the Iroquois League of Five Nations, whose roots lie around the 12th or 13th century. This confederation initially included the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk tribes, which occupied a territory largely located in what is now the state of New York. According to oral tradition, a spiritual guide named Hiawatha, with the help of a figure sometimes referred to as Diganawida, or the Great Peacemaker, worked to unite these chronically conflicting nations. The stories describe how Hiawatha suffered from war and the loss of his loved ones, before conveying a message of peace and solidarity to end cycles of violence. The figure of Hiawatha remains shrouded in an aura of mythology, as it is arduous to distinguish historical facts from the oral embellishments accumulated over generations. However, the importance of the wampum clearly emerges as an essential vector of cohesion. The wampum was made up of small cylindrical or discoidal beads, primarily crafted from shells marinated in coastal areas. These beads, usually white or purple, were then strung and woven to form belts that carried diplomatic, spiritual, or procedural messages. In the Iroquoian tradition, the wampum belt could be read as a symbolic text, each pattern representing a pact, treaty, or memorandum fundamental to the good conduct of peace among allied nations. Beyond the diplomatic system conveyed by the wampum, the League of Five Nations was structured around a grand council where chiefs, chosen by the elder women of each clan, debated common affairs. Traditional narratives emphasize the vision of Diganawida, who advocated for reconciliation and balance among members of the Confederation. Each nation retained its internal autonomy, but all committed to resolving their disputes without resorting to violence. This ideal of concord was sometimes tested, notably when wars broke out for territorial or economic reasons. Nonetheless, the institutional framework resulting from the League remained a major advancement for the region, laying the foundations of political stability rarely equaled at that time in the eastern part of the North American continent. In parallel, the trade of copper extracted around Lake Superior became a central element of economic relations in this geographic area. For millennia, local societies had learned to hammer and shape native copper, transforming it into projectile points, fish hooks, and symbolic jewelry. The durability and malleability of this metal attracted traders from the east and south, who sought these objects for their effectiveness and prestige. The deposits, particularly located on the present-day Keweenaw Peninsula, provided a raw material appreciated far beyond the shores of the lake. The trade flows of copper sometimes joined those of other valuable commodities, thus reinforcing the strategic role of waterways in the Northeast. Chert flint, a type of rock highly sought after for the making of weapons and tools, was also the subject of intense trade throughout this vast region. The best quality chert sources were notably located in Ohio, where natural quarries provided the raw material. Native American craftsmen then shaped arrowheads, scrapers, and other essential tools for daily life. These objects circulated along waterways and land routes to Iroquoian territories and to other peoples connected by alliances or trade. The ability to precisely carve these stone pieces gave a certain military and economic advantage, reinforcing the importance of control or privileged access to top-quality chert sources. The progressive union between agricultural know-how and the mastery of such mineral resources contributed to the emergence of a flourishing exchange economy. Corn, by spreading to more northern regions, led to a notable population increase, creating a higher demand for stone tools and prestige objects. During this period, the barter system became increasingly complex, exchanging food products like dried fish, beaver pelts, or surplus grains for copper points or polished chert blades. On some archaeological sites, significant concentrations of raw materials from distant lands are found today, testifying to the extent of these trade networks and the diversity of interactions. The cultural diversity of the Northeast was also reflected in the multiplicity of languages, funeral customs, and forms of political organization. Smaller groupings than the League of the Five Nations persisted, and some peoples were not directly integrated into this confederation. Nevertheless, Iroquoian cultural influence was felt in the way of managing crops, honoring the land, and organizing alliances. Intertribal councils could bring together representatives from various backgrounds to discuss shared hunting issues or commercial disputes. Family structures, often guided by matrilineal descent, gave women significant rights. Many elder women actively participated in critical decisions and reinforced the transmission of oral traditions between generations. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, the human dynamic of the Northeast and Great Lakes region was characterized by a subtle balance between competition and cooperation. Conflicts could erupt over the control of fertile lands or fishing areas, but the possibility of forging vast exchange networks also encouraged peaceful coexistence. In several fortified sites, the remnants of defensive palisades can be observed, likely erected in response to external threats. Conversely, the rise of the Iroquois League and other regional alliances demonstrates a common desire to regulate violence to preserve arable lands. Men, women, and children lived in sync with the seasons, synchronizing community ceremonies with the harvests. During the 15th century, some specialists estimate that certain agglomerations could already reach several thousand inhabitants, forming true fortified towns. The ditches, wooden walls, and concentric arrangements of longhouses indicate an advanced social organization, where collective cooperation served common defense. Clan leaders, chosen for their wisdom and eloquence, relied on village assemblies to make decisions. Gradually, the human concentration around water points or fertile lands intensified the exploitation of natural resources, requiring more thoughtful management of local fauna and flora. Iroquoian stories also mention large ritual fires intended to honor ancestors and sanctify upcoming harvests. At the very end of the 15th century, Europe began to have sporadic contact with the North Atlantic coast of America. Although the Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto, known as John Cabot in English, conducted a British expedition along these shores in 1497, it was mainly Basque fishermen who, from the late 15th and early 16th centuries, played an essential role in establishing early economic relations with native communities. Originating from a region straddling present-day Spain and France, they had a long tradition of offshore fishing and were constantly seeking bountiful fishing grounds to practice their craft. The cold waters of the Northwest Atlantic, particularly near the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, contained an exceptional abundance of cod. The Basques, renowned for the quality of their shipbuilding and salting techniques, traveled great distances to exploit these fisheries of unequaled richness. Salt, which they obtained thanks to the salt marshes on the Basque coast, facilitated the preservation of cod, a highly prized product in Europe, especially in the religious context, where fasting and abstinence from red meat encouraged the consumption of fish. Basque expeditions, driven by growing competition from other European navigators, sometimes set up seasonal camps along the shores in sheltered coves that could serve as drying and smoking stations for the fish. In exchange for various goods, mainly metal or glass objects, these sailors could obtain furs from the indigenous peoples eager to acquire new tools, a sign of possible technological and cultural advantage. Although cod initially occupied the center of these early transactions, the fur trade, particularly beaver skins, gradually gained importance, paving the way for a more structured commerce that, a few decades later, would be exploited on a large scale by colonial powers such as France and England. As these unique trade exchanges intensify, another decisive factor occurs involuntarily. Europeans, upon landing on American shores, carry pathogens familiar in Europe, but completely foreign to the immune systems of the indigenous peoples. Smallpox is one of the deadliest viruses introduced into this part of the world, and its impact is devastating. On the North Atlantic coast, various indigenous groups, including the Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, Maritime Algonquians, and groups from the coast of Maine, find themselves exposed to a pathogen against which they possess no collective immunity. According to accounts and later estimates by historians and anthropologists, it is believed that in the span of a few successive epidemic periods from the late 16th to the 17th century, some coastal villages suffer mortality rates approaching 50 to 90%. The destructive symptoms of smallpox, coupled with cultural shock, generate a rapid demographic collapse. The local shamans and healers, confronted with an ailment they cannot cure, sometimes lose much of their credibility or simply perish during the waves of contagion. Survivors often flee the coastal areas or retreat inland, exacerbating the social and political disarray of already shaken communities. Ancestral traditions and skills may be lost or diminished, as elders, the principal keepers of collective memory, frequently succumb. For Europeans, the situation occasionally presents the deceptive illusion of sparsely populated or near-empty lands, which would later encourage many settlers to move in, often without understanding the human and cultural tragedy that had unfolded. While the Basques, Bretons, and other populations of Atlantic Europe quietly consolidate their exchanges of salted cod for furs, the French crown begins to take a greater interest in this vast territory, described by some explorers as an inexhaustible reservoir of natural wealth. In 1603, Pierre Dugas de Mons, mandated by the King of France, begins an exploration of the St. Lawrence River with the cartographer Samuel de Champlain. 2 years later, Champlain founds a settlement in Port Royal in Acadia, in present-day Nova Scotia, but it is the creation of Quebec in 1608, on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, that marks the permanent base of New France. Champlain, an adventurer, geographer, and above all a savvy diplomat, quickly understands the necessity of forging strong alliances with the peoples inhabiting the vast Laurentian Valley and its surroundings. The St. Lawrence Algonquins, as well as the Innu, called Montagnais by the French, and the Wendat, often referred to as Hurons by Europeans, prove to be indispensable in the fur trade, as they control extensive exchange networks, linking trapping areas farther west to the Atlantic coast. Champlain sees in this collaboration the opportunity to secure the supply of beaver pelts and other valuable furs at a time when Europe is enamored with beaver felt hats, considered the ultimate symbol of sophistication. In return, the indigenous alliances benefit from military support and access to European weapons and tools, invaluable for consolidating their regional influence. However, allying with the French inevitably involves confronting other indigenous political coalitions, notably the Iroquois, traditional enemies of the Wendat, and some northern Algonquians. It is within this broader context that in 1609, the confrontation known as the Battle of Lake Champlain takes place, an event which Samuel de Champlain will leave a detailed account of. Seeking to support his allies, Champlain accompanies a warrior contingent made up of Algonquins, Innu, and Wendat, who want to launch a punitive expedition against an Iroquois group, presumably Mohawk, to the south of the lake. The two forces meet on the shore, and during the skirmish, Champlain uses an arquebus, a firearm unknown to the Iroquois until then. The account relates that at the first shot, 2 Iroquois chiefs fall, causing panic in their ranks. The Wendat and their allies thus achieve a resounding victory. In Iroquois oral tradition, this use of the firearm will remain etched as an act of great violence, embodying the sudden and dramatic shift in power dynamics. It is not certain that Champlain had the specific intention to upset the diplomatic balance beyond his support for his partners. However, this armed engagement will intensify the rivalries between the Iroquois Confederacy and the allies of the French. Local esotericism, shamanic symbolism, and rituals of vengeance then insert themselves into a larger narrative of geopolitical competitions, where even modest European technology and the gradual establishment of stable settlements gradually transform the political structure of the region. On the North American coast, other Europeans, mainly English, also begin to establish permanent colonies in the early decades of the 17th century. While New France occupies the lands along the St. Lawrence, English trading and religious missions invest in the New England coast. Colonies like Plymouth in 1620 or the Massachusetts Bay in 1630 develop rapidly, regularly receiving new settlers fleeing political or religious instability in England. However, the early times are marked by serious difficulties: food shortages, diseases, lack of knowledge of a sometimes harsh natural environment, not to mention possible tensions with native groups already afflicted by imported epidemics. A particular episode illustrates the complex and unexpected encounters recorded in these early colonial days: the relationship between the Puritan settlers of Plymouth and Tisquantum, often called Squanto in English sources. His personal story reveals the clash of worlds and the growing interweaving between Native Americans and Europeans in a context where demographic, cultural, and political balance is changing rapidly. Tisquantum, originally from the Patuxet community near Plymouth Bay, had crossed paths with English navigators a few years prior. According to the most widespread version, he was kidnapped around 1614-1615 by a certain Thomas Hunt, who intended to take him and other native captives to Europe to sell them as slaves in Spain. However, Tisquantum eventually found himself in England, where he learned the language and became familiar with some aspects of English culture. Through persuasion and taking advantage of micro-networks of humanitarian or religious support, he managed to return to his native continent, not without having undergone several trials. When he finally arrives in New England, he discovers that his Patuxet village has been decimated by an epidemic, likely smallpox or a similar disease. With no close family left, Tisquantum finds himself the only, or nearly the only, survivor of his community. Upon the arrival of the Plymouth settlers, he seizes the opportunity to establish peaceful contact by acting as an interpreter and cultural mediator, since his knowledge of English was a major asset in facilitating communication. At the end of 1620 and beginning of 1621, as the Plymouth colonists struggle to subsist, Tisquantum teaches them indigenous farming techniques adapted to the region's soil, including corn cultivation. He recommends them to bury a fish, or fish remains with each seed, to fertilize the sandy soil. This method allows maximizing the yield of unproductive fields, as the decomposition of the fish provides essential nutrients for the plant's growth. Besides the purely technical aspect, the gift of this agricultural knowledge also has a strong symbolic significance. Through Tisquantum, the ancient Patuxet knowledge and local Native American traditions are passed on to prevent the colony from falling into famine. In return, the colonists recognize in him a valuable partner for maintaining peace with Chief Massasoit, an eminent figure of the Wampanoag Confederation. This diplomatic relationship is strained in many ways. Wampanoag leaders believed the alliance with the English could restore balance against other neighboring groups, while the Plymouth colonists seek security and indigenous support to ensure their long-term survival. For Tisquantum, serving as a bridge between two worlds allows him to regain a form of social role after the disappearance of his people. His name, often mispronounced by European sources, likely holds a spiritual dimension, evoking the power of the earth or certain sacred rituals. Within this emerging microcosm, the importance of corn as a staple food is coupled with a shared symbolism. For the colonists, it becomes the emblematic product of their adaptation to the New World. For the Native Americans, it represents an age-old legacy closely associated with survival and seasonal rites. The stories later popularized, especially around the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States, sometimes exaggerate the cordiality of the relationships. In reality, while cultural bridges are being built, they often remain marked by political opportunism. Tisquantum is suspected by Massasoit of wanting to redirect this new alliance to his advantage and to establish himself as the sole interlocutor to strengthen his own influence. On the English side, some colonists see these connections as a temporary entryway, already dreaming of further expansion, gradually causing the emergence of future conflicts. Nevertheless, at the time, the reciprocal exchange of indigenous knowledge for minimal European technology serves as the foundation for a fragile agreement. The story of Tisquantum, oscillating between abduction, stay in Europe, return to America, and role as interpreter, represents a microcosm of the growing complexity caused by the first encounters between Europeans and Native Americans. As the Basques, French, and English multiply their contacts by exploiting the Atlantic coast, and as alliances are forged or broken based on commercial, military, and political imperatives, all indigenous populations gradually face a radical transformation of their environment. The example of Lake Champlain illustrates the appearance of firearms in intertribal conflicts, while smallpox and other diseases continue to weaken numerous communities. By 1620, the English of Plymouth, to survive, must contend with the indigenous presence, gleaning concrete lessons about food production while imposing, willingly or not, economic and diplomatic changes in the region. A few hundred kilometers to the north, Samuel de Champlain continues his New France project, with Quebec as a trade and political foothold. Franco-Indigenous relations, though based on a certain mutual respect in the early decades, are not free from misunderstandings and violence. The alliances concluded by Champlain require participation in wars that are not only those of the French, but more so the expression of long-standing rivalries between indigenous confederations. The Iroquois Confederacy, enduringly hurt by the arrival of European technology in these confrontations, will redouble efforts to counter the Wendat and Algonquian expansion, supported by France. In this entanglement, the question of territoriality, control of river routes, and the flow of furs fuels new conflicts, destined to redraw all the political maps of the region. That being said, the phenomena of mixing, both linguistic and cultural, are multiplying. Indigenous interpreters learn to handle European dress codes, religion, and diplomacy. while some French people sometimes adopt the lifestyle of local communities, becoming coureurs des bois or marrying indigenous women. The English-speaking world, on the other hand, often remains more separated, at least initially, as the Puritan colonial structure established at Plymouth and in the Massachusetts Bay remains strongly focused on religious and social cohesion of the white community. However, Tisquantum demonstrates that bridges can emerge, exchanging not only goods, but also knowledge, stories, and solutions to overcome the challenges posed by a new environment. This man, whose personal destiny is quite uncommon, finds himself interacting with both Wampanoag chiefs and English governors, connecting two worlds that previously seemed entirely separate. Through his mediation, the cultivation of corn, already central to nearly all indigenous agricultural societies in America, comes to feed a group of destitute European migrants. In other words, in a territory where diseases, competition for resources, and ancient rivalries push toward confrontation, mutual learning, albeit partial and tinged with self-interest, sometimes allows for the finding of an ephemeral balance. With the transatlantic migration currents beginning to intensify in the mid-17th century, these early episodes of contact, marked by both acts of mutual aid and unprecedented violence, will have a determining impact on the subsequent Euro-indigenous relations. Diseases continue to circulate and decimate communities, while the thirst for furs and the advance of colonization persist. The Europeans' discovery of the vast commercial potential of the continent's interior, particularly allowing the French to penetrate further along the Great Lakes, brings about other upheavals that accentuate the geopolitical reshuffling. The rivalry between European states is exported to the New World, and indigenous alliances become fully fledged diplomatic actors, struggling to preserve their interests. By the 1630s and 1640s, the English colonists of the Atlantic coast, in rapid demographic expansion, pushed the frontier westward, prompting stronger resistance from the indigenous nations inhabiting the region. Meanwhile, the French consolidate their presence on the St. Lawrence, focusing on more structured fur exchanges and a stable, although perpetually precarious, network of alliances. During the period from 1670 to 1815, North America experiences profound upheavals related to the fur wars, colonial rivalries, and the territorial reshuffling that results. Alliances are formed and broken between European powers and indigenous nations, while the region's precarious balance shifts with the commercial and military conflicts. Major events of this period include the confrontation between the Hudson's Bay Company and the French coureurs de bois, the Beaver Wars led by the Iroquois, the involvement of southeastern nations in the imperial conflict between the English and the French, the impact of the American Revolution of 1776-1783 on the Haudenosaunee, and finally, Tecumseh's unifying aspirations during the War of 1812. For an international audience unfamiliar with these dynamics, it is crucial to understand how these conflicts are articulated in a context of complex alliances and the desire for beaver pelts, a key resource of the era. Everything begins in 1670. When King Charles II of England grants a group of merchants a monopoly over the vast watershed of Hudson Bay, located in the northern part of the continent. Named the Hudson's Bay Company, this joint stock corporation obtains the exclusive right to trade in a territory then known as Rupert's Land. The English investors, supported by the king's first cousin, Prince Rupert, aim to compete with New France, which had already established an extensive fur trade network along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes for several decades. The French coureurs de bois, these often unofficial adventurers operating on the margins of big monopolies and capable of covering long distances by canoe, form the vital link to gather and exchange furs and goods with indigenous nations. Between fortified trading posts and small frontier colonies, the English and French sought to win the favor of their indigenous partners, especially because the North American beaver turned into felt for hats, fetched exorbitant prices on European markets. The indigenous nations, for their part, are not mere passive recipients of these exchanges. They swiftly perceive the opportunity to negotiate their alliance at the best price, whether in arms, fabrics, metal utensils, or other precious goods. This commercial dynamic fosters the emergence of new power relationships in this vast territory. Among the groups most involved in the trade are the Iroquois, a federation of nations speaking Iroquoian languages. They are often called Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse, and they include several initial nations: the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. By the second half of the 17th century, these nations engage in actual military campaigns to secure privileged access to trapping areas, especially those rich in beavers. These conflicts, known as the Beaver Wars, culminate in repeated attacks against other indigenous peoples of Ohio and the Great Lake Erie region, aiming to capture hunting territories and eliminate competition in the supply of furs intended for resale. In this intense context, the Ohio Valley becomes the crucial stake of Iroquois expansion and Franco-English rivalries. The Iroquois, supported at various times by English merchants wishing to weaken New France, do not hesitate to forcibly displace or eliminate competing nations to control the trade. The French, wary of the Iroquois advance, seek to build a series of forts along the waterways to protect supply routes. French posts multiply. Fort Frontenac, founded in 1673 near present-day Kingston, Ontario, Fort Niagara in 1726, and Fort Duquesne in 1754 at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers in present-day Pennsylvania. The aim is to secure the river link connecting the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi Basin while countering English intrusions in the region. Diplomatic efforts unfold as the Iroquois sometimes try to exploit the Franco-English rivalry by negotiating with one or the other side, as this allows them to obtain advantageous trade conditions. The result is a constant geopolitical evolution, where each faction strives to convince or coerce more indigenous nations to join them. In the southeast, another theater of confrontation is developing with an additional factor. Alliances between tribes such as the Choctaws, Chickasaws, or even the Cherokees play a significant role in the balance of powers. The Choctaws traditionally have closer ties with the French, while the Chickasaws and, to some extent, the Cherokees often align with the English for commercial, military interests, or to protect themselves from the expansion of other neighbors. The orography, the management of river routes, particularly that of the Mississippi River, and the presence of growing European colonies reinforce the strategic nature of the region. The French, established around the Gulf of Mexico and Mobile, founded in 1702, and New Orleans, founded in 1718, seek to establish a communication corridor between Louisiana and Canada. The English, already settled on the Atlantic coast since the founding of Jamestown in 1607, are extending their sphere of influence westward through Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. In this complex balancing act, the southeastern indigenous nations rely on their alliances to consolidate their autonomy. They provide furs, sometimes slaves captured during raids, and in exchange receive weapons or manufactured goods of crucial interest for the survival of their societies in an increasingly militarized environment. The 18th century is also marked by the intertwining of European colonial conflicts imported to North American soil. The rivalry between France and England culminates in the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, known in North America as the War of Conquest. The resulting treaties, notably the Treaty of Paris of 1763, redraw the continental mappa. France cedes most of its possessions east of the Mississippi to Great Britain and transfers Louisiana to Spain. This geopolitical reorganization, which occurs even before the American Revolution, leaves the indigenous nations in a precarious position. Many are now facing a narrower range of European partners, thereby reducing their ability to assert their demands by playing on the Franco-British rivalry. However, tensions do not fully decrease. Leaders like Pontiac of the Odawa rise up in 1763 to defend indigenous territories, protesting against British control. Although Pontiac's uprising in the Great Lakes region is suppressed, it proves that the indigenous peoples do not passively accept English domination. Then, starting in 1776, the American Revolution disrupts the established relations. The 13 colonies rise against the British Crown, seeking to gain political and economic independence. Many indigenous groups find themselves caught in this new war, as they have to choose between supporting the British Crown, which, although not always honoring its promises, limits the expansion of American colonies, and joining the insurgents' camp, which sometimes promises recognition and compensation. The Haudenosaunee, located in the border regions of northern New York State, internally split, the Oneidas and part of the Tuscaroras, a nation late integrated into the Haudenosaunee, align with the American cause, while the Mohawks and some Onondagas decide to fight alongside the British, believing that the Crown's victory is their best guarantee for preserving their lands. Intranational conflicts divide families and create lasting grievances. Thus, Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader, establishes himself as a staunch ally of the British. Meanwhile, other Iroquois clans hesitate or change allegiance amid complex diplomatic discussions. Raids, the plundering of villages, the burning of granaries, and the destruction of crops severely affect the Iroquois Confederacy, decimating years of accumulated wealth and undermining the economic balance patiently built around trade and agriculture. At the end of the war, concluded in 1783 by the Treaty of Paris, the United States is officially recognized. Loyalist Iroquois are forced to flee to Canada, where the Crown sometimes grants them land on the shores of the Great Lake Ontario to reward them for their support. The American Revolution also has consequences in the Ohio Valley, where many Shawnee, Delaware, also known as Lenape, Mingo, and Miami nations, are concerned about the rapid expansion of American settlers seeking to establish themselves on the fertile lands of the region. Conflicts continue in northwest Ohio, despite the Royal Proclamation of 1763, theoretically intended to prohibit British settlers from settling west of the Appalachians. American independence rendered this text null and void for the Patriots, and the treaties signed, with some local chiefs, are scarcely respected by the waves of migrants in search of new lands. In this climate of tension, intertribal alliances begin to gradually take shape to try to collectively resist the advance of American settlers. Violent clashes occur, leading to successive treaties that push the frontier further and further west, defined by the young United States government. American authorities also organized military expeditions to crush indigenous resistance, overseen by generals like Anthony Wayne, who, in 1794, defeats a coalition of nations at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in northwest Ohio. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795, among others that follow, formalizes the opening to colonization of large portions of indigenous territories. In this context of upheaval, an actor emerges at the turn of the 19th century. Tecumseh, a charismatic Shawnee chief, born around 1768 in the Scioto River Valley, a tributary of the Ohio. He witnesses, from an early age, the ravages caused by successive wars, the destruction of native villages, and the almost unending influx of settlers. Together with his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the prophet for his spiritual visions and his desire to save indigenous customs, Tecumseh seeks to unify the indigenous nations of the region in order to present a united front and halt the American encroachment on their ancestral lands. His efforts go beyond mere regional cooperation, as he strives to build a pan-Indian confederation, bringing together nations from both the Northwest and some from the South, and, as much as possible, rallying the Iroquois nations weakened by previous conflicts. The goal is to create a large indigenous bloc, a true buffer state, supported by British power, to prevent the Americans from definitively taking over all territories west of the Appalachians. The outbreak of the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain takes place in this explosive climate. The causes of this new conflict include trade tensions across the Atlantic, motives of national pride, and the American desire to seize Canada, seen as poorly defended. On the British side, the priority is to protect the colony of Upper Canada, present-day Ontario, and to contain American expansionism. Tecumseh, seeing an opportunity to slow the advance of settlers, chooses to ally with the British, convinced that only this alliance can constitute a vast indigenous bloc shielded from American pressure. He leads with determination a coalition of warriors from multiple nations in various skirmishes along the border. The city of Detroit, strategic in importance, is briefly captured by the British Army and its indigenous allies in 1812, thanks to the cunning and intimidation orchestrated by Tecumseh and British General Isaac Brock. However, the situation quickly evolves. The continuous pressure from American forces, better supplied with men and ammunition, eventually undermines the coalition. Strategic divergences between the different indigenous leaders, the rise of the colonization movement, and the partial withdrawal of British support when they themselves come under pressure directly threaten the Pan-Indian Confederation project. Decisive battles are concentrated in the region of Upper Canada near Lake Erie, where the Americans launch major offensives. In October 1813, a major confrontation occurs during the Battle of the Thames, also known as the Battle of Moraviantown, in what is now the province of Ontario. During this battle, the American Army, led by General William Henry Harrison, faces the British and their native allies, among whom is Tecumseh. During the engagement, the British quickly retreat, leaving Tecumseh's warriors outnumbered. The death of Tecumseh that day, recounted differently according to various sources, abruptly ends the hope of a coherent native confederation capable of long-term resistance against American expansion. The Northwest nations lose their most influential leader and find themselves dispersed, lacking sufficiently strong leadership to continue large-scale resistance. The period from 1800 to 1865 in the United States marks a crucial phase of territorial expansion and conflicts with native nations, both militarily and legislatively. The ideology known as the Frontier Doctrine spreads throughout American political and popular culture, asserting that westward expansion is a near-divine right, even a historical mission, for the young country. This belief is based on the idea of a continental America destined to be occupied and civilized by the descendants of European settlers. In this context, rapid population growth, the lure of new agricultural lands, and the discovery of natural resources fuel the quest for new spaces. Federal and state governments encourage colonization, sign ambiguous treaties with native peoples, and plan major migration routes like the famous Oregon Trail. For Native American nations, these advances come with a total upheaval of their way of life. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson negotiates the purchase of Louisiana from Napoleon Bonaparte's France. This transaction, known as the Louisiana Purchase, nearly doubles the size of the United States, extending American influence to the edges of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. Explorations, including the Lewis and Clark expedition from 1804 to 1806, confirmed the agricultural and commercial potential of these territories, while mapping regions still unfamiliar to the American public. The idea that this vast expanse of land is meant to be cultivated and populated by families of settlers gains popularity, reinforcing the conviction that it is the federal government's responsibility to ensure that obstacles to this expansion are removed. Among these obstacles are the indigenous tribes, present for millennia, who already have established social and territorial organizations. During the early decades of the 19th century, the pressures to migrate westward become increasingly strong, supported by a network of main roads and trails that facilitate the movement of pioneers. The Oregon Trail, which emerged informally in the 1810s and was heavily used starting in the 1840s, becomes a symbol of American advancement through the mountains and valleys. Thousands of families embark on this adventure, facing shortages of water, food, and contagious diseases, with the idea of finding fertile lands and new commercial opportunities. Meanwhile, the California Gold Rush, which begins in 1848 after deposits are discovered in the Sutter's Mill area, attracts a crowd of prospectors from all walks of life. The West gains a mythical dimension, encouraged by stories of wealth and prosperity. In this climate of enterprise and conquest, the United States government adopts drastic legislative measures to force the relocation of indigenous peoples. Foremost among these measures is the Indian Removal Act, enacted in 1830 under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. This law grants the federal government the power to negotiate, often under duress, the exchange of tribal lands located east of the Mississippi River for territories in the West, particularly in what would become the region of Oklahoma. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole communities gradually find themselves forced to accept these disadvantageous treaties. However, resistance is manifested among several tribes, notably among the Cherokees, who seek to assert their rights before the Supreme Court. This legal battle captures public attention, but struggles to counter the determination of the executive and lawmakers supportive of settlers. The forced removal of the Cherokees illustrates the brutality of U.S. policies of this era. Known as the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee exodus truly begins in 1838, after the American army is ordered to gather men, women, and children into collection camps before directing them to new territories in the West. The travel conditions are appalling. Disease, hunger, and exposure to the elements decimate the columns of families forced to travel more than 1,500 kilometers. Historians estimate that around 4,000 Cherokees died during this journey, nearly a quarter of the displaced population. Among the notable witnesses to this tragedy, the voice of John Ross, the principal Cherokee chief, often called the principal chief, resonates as a painful echo. He sends poignant messages to the authorities, describing his people's distress and vainly requesting humanitarian assistance. The Indian Removal Act is not limited to the Cherokees alone. In the following years, other nations undergo massive population transfers. The Choctaws are displaced as early as 1831, while the Chickasaws and Creeks suffer the same fate in the 1830s. These enforced migrations take place under similar conditions: military oversight, logistical shortcomings, epidemics, and temporary famines. To justify these policies, the American government invokes the principle of the inevitability of white expansion and the alleged inability of indigenous peoples to adapt to the requirements of European-style agricultural life. The new territories often prove less fertile than promised and the tribe's social structures are profoundly affected. In the east, the lands thus liberated allow the establishment of cotton plantations, fueled by the labor of African slaves, while racist ideology is reinforced in political discourse. Meanwhile, the massive introduction of the horse onto the plains brings about significant upheaval for the indigenous peoples inhabiting these vast grasslands. From the late 18th century, tribes such as the Comanches or the Lakotas gradually adopt horseback riding and develop new hunting and combat strategies. The horse facilitates mobility, allows for the pursuit of bison herds over long distances, and transforms the socio-economic structure of these nations. Commercial exchanges between tribes, as well as raids conducted to capture horses and establish regional supremacy, multiply. War itself becomes the subject of reorganization. Riders can move quickly, strike the enemy by surprise, and retreat just as swiftly. This nomadic warfare mode stands in stark contrast to the infantry and artillery tactics favored by the American Army, making conflicts even more complex. The Comanches, in particular, are renowned for their exceptional mastery of horseback riding and mounted warfare techniques. They establish a vast territory of influence stretching from the present-day Texas to northern Mexico, forming what some historians have called the Comanche Empire. Alongside the Lakotas and other nations of the northern plains, they adopt a defense strategy sometimes referred to as a circle of fire, consisting of encircling the enemy through coordinated horse attacks, then retreating to let scouts and archers harass enemy lines. These methods make colonists' conquest particularly difficult, leading to a long series of negotiations and skirmishes that the government and the U.S. Army attempt to manage through treaty signings, often broken as soon as a new influx of pioneers demands the opening of additional lands. Armed conflicts are not limited to the Great Plains. In the southeast, the Seminole Wars, which began in 1817, continue for decades. The Seminole peoples, composed of former Creeks, free Africans, and various indigenous groups, fiercely resist the displacement policy. They retreat into the swamps and forests of Florida, using the dense vegetation to evade the columns of soldiers dispatched by the government. The fighting intensifies particularly during the Second Seminole War, 1835-1842, conducted notably under the presidency of Andrew Jackson and continued under Martin Van Buren. The Seminoles adopt a guerrilla form, attacking by surprise and avoiding frontal combat. This resistance forces the U.S. Army to deploy significant resources, and settlers, frightened, hesitate to settle in still disputed areas. Nevertheless, military pressure eventually prevails, forcing the majority of the Seminoles into exile. Among the most famous episodes of these wars are the capture and death of the Seminole chief Osceola. Born around 1804 to a Creek mother and a supposed English origin father, Osceola emerges as one of the great leaders of the Seminole resistance. Charismatic, cunning, and deeply determined to defend the rights of his people, he distinguishes himself by his ability to rally warriors and organize ambush operations against the army. However, in October 1837, Osceola is captured following a negotiation under a flag of truce, an act that raises an outcry even in American public opinion. Transferred to South Carolina, he dies a few months later in January 1838, imprisoned at Fort Moultrie. His death feeds the legend of an integral leader betrayed by an army that did not respect the truce conventions and marks a turning point in the history of the Seminole resistance. At the heart of these conflicts, the issue of indigenous sovereignty remains an essential concern. Tribes attempt, when possible, to negotiate with the United States as autonomous powers, as prescribed by several prior treaties. However, over the years, federal policy favors a paternalistic and expansionist vision, considering tribes as dependent domestic nations. Land rights, guaranteed by some landmark judicial decisions such as Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, often remain unheeded in face of the growing appetite for land and resources. New mining deposits, such as gold discovered in Georgia in the 1820s, spark a frenzy of speculation, and authorities struggle to contain the uncontrolled rush of prospectors. Indigenous populations, even those attempting assimilation, suffer from constant intrusions into their territories. Despite strong protests from missionaries, philanthropic associations, and some political figures, the dominant line remains eviction. Settlers, meanwhile, often perceive these displacements as a necessary sacrifice for national greatness. Newspapers of the time extensively report the successes of settlers established on new lands while ignoring the systematic violence inflicted on indigenous communities. The writings of John Ross, as well as eyewitness accounts of the Trail of Tears, do not reverse the general trend, although they sometimes provoke indignation among a minority of Americans. In some areas, temporary peace agreements allow tribes to subsist, but demographic growth and economic expansion eventually render these compromises obsolete. The great nations of the plains, for their part, see their territories invaded despite past alliances or their military strength, now threatened by the industrialization of the war effort. The 1850s proved to be a decisive decade in the pursuit of this expansionist logic. With the ratification of several additional treaties, the governments of border states consolidated their grip on strategic areas, encouraging the settlement of farmers and entrepreneurs. Transportation infrastructure also progressed rapidly. Railroad projects began to serve Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri, foreshadowing a future transcontinental line. Although the issue of slavery increasingly occupied national debate, land disputes involving native nations did not disappear. Several of these nations, hoping to retain a semblance of sovereignty, signed treaties that limited their hunting and fishing rights while supposedly guaranteeing lasting peace. In reality, these agreements quickly became void as a new influx of settlers demanded the opening of more land for cereal crops or intensive livestock farming. In the Western Territories, the massive presence of gold prospectors, trappers, and ranchers caused constant pressure on local ecosystems. The bison population, crucial for the diet and culture of the Plains nations, began a worrisome decline. Some settlers slaughtered these great herbivores for their meat, leather, or simply to deprive the natives of their sustenance. The natives, whose survival depended on summer hunting, saw this vital resource dangerously dwindle. Furthermore, diseases brought by migrants, such as smallpox or measles, continued to spread, causing devastation among the nations that were particularly vulnerable to them. While the Federal Army established forts to protect trade routes and monitor the native populations, sporadic clashes occurred, foreshadowing the intensification of the Indian Wars in the following decades. During the second half of the 18th century, the geopolitical dynamics in North America were profoundly transformed. European colonists, notably the British, extended their influence inland, seeking to access new resources and expand their settlement areas. The native nations, which had woven complex commercial and diplomatic ties among themselves, found themselves facing increasing pressure from colonial governments. In 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War accelerated these transformations. France ceded a large part of its North American possessions to the British Crown. At the same time, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was intended as a legal and political response to the question of native territories and the future organization of these vast regions, still largely unknown to Europeans. The Royal Proclamation, issued in the name of King George III, formally recognized that native nations retained certain forms of sovereignty over their lands while imposing strict control over the sale and cession of territories. It stipulated that the acquisition of new native lands could only be conducted through the Crown, thus prohibiting individuals and private companies from acting at their discretion. For many First Nations, this text was perceived as a guarantee, at least symbolically, of their possession rights. However, in practice, colonists and colonial representatives often tried to circumvent these provisions, leading to frequent land conflicts in the subsequent decades. In the region corresponding to what is now Western Canada, the concrete impact of the Royal Proclamation proved to be gradual. The lands northwest of the Great Lakes were less populated by colonists during the 18th century compared to the Atlantic coastal areas. However, British fur companies, like the Hudson's Bay Company, were keenly interested in the vast plains and boreal forests rich in wildlife. Trading posts multiplied, creating new exchange networks for pelts, clothing, pemmican, and manufactured goods. These exchanges also established new alliances between European traders and native peoples, while altering local political balances. The organized colonization of Western Canada took a decisive turn at the beginning of the 19th century, notably thanks to the initiative of Lord Selkirk, a Scottish aristocrat and significant shareholder of the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1811, he obtained authorization from the company's council to establish the Red River Settlement at the site of what is now Winnipeg, at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers. His goal was to settle Scottish farmers on these fertile lands to create a colony capable of supplying wheat and other provisions to the company employees. This venture took place in a context already marked by the presence of the Métis, a community born from alliances between indigenous women and European traders. The Métis of the Red River, who often speak a dialect mixing French, Cree, and Anishinaabe, developed their own culture based on bison hunting, the cart, and family know-how passed down through generations. Over the years, they acquire a collective consciousness of their identity. The attempts by Lord Selkirk and the Hudson's Bay Company to impose authority on the colony clash with the Métis' deep attachment to their hunting grounds and way of life. Tensions arise, sometimes violently, as evidenced by the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, where several people lost their lives during an armed confrontation. Beyond these conflicts, the economic and political influence of the Hudson's Bay Company in the region remains predominant for much of the 19th century. Indigenous peoples negotiate treaties or enter into oral agreements with the company's representatives, hoping to secure access to vital resources such as bison and fish, or to preserve the freedom to move across the vast spaces of the West. Meanwhile, Catholic and Protestant missionaries settle in Métis and indigenous communities, introducing new educational and religious models. Gradually, the Franco-Catholic identity of a part of the Métis strengthens, while others adopt more Anglophone or Protestant practices, illustrating growing cultural diversity. In 1867, Canadian Confederation officially comes into being, bringing together the province of Canada, the present-day Ontario and Quebec, as well as New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, under a single federal government. The new Dominion of Canada, led by Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, quickly begins to consider expansion westward to create a vast national entity from sea to sea. The acquisition of territories administered by the Hudson's Bay Company becomes a major issue. In 1869, Canada concludes an agreement to purchase Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory, but fails to adequately consult the Indigenous and Métis populations settled on these lands for generations. It is in this context that the Red River Rebellion arises, led in 1869-1870 by Louis Riel, a Métis leader born in the region. Deeply committed to preserving the territorial and cultural rights of his people, Riel opposes the arrival of English-speaking Canadian officials who intend to expropriate or ignore the claims of the Métis inhabitants. The confrontation peaks when a Canadian government envoy is arrested and then executed for treason, causing indignation in official circles in Ottawa. Nonetheless, Riel manages to negotiate the creation of the province of Manitoba, enshrined by the Manitoba Act in 1870, which initially guarantees certain linguistic and religious protections for the Métis while solidifying their integration into Canada. Despite the founding of this new province, tensions do not disappear. Many Métis feel that their land rights are not truly protected, as federal bureaucrats delay the distribution of land titles promised by the legislation. Meanwhile, other actors, such as settlers from the east or land speculators, quickly claim prime parcels, multiplying disputes. While some Métis choose to leave the Red River region to settle further west, the federal authorities continue their project of unification and economic development of the territory by launching future railway projects intended to connect Ontario to the Western Plains. In this same momentum, the Canadian government begins negotiating a series of official treaties with the Indigenous nations. Between 1871 and 1877, it concludes the first numbered agreements, called Treaties 1 through 7, primarily targeting communities established in the southern part of the prairie. Subsequently, until 1921, other treaties, up to number 11, will be signed, covering a vast area from southern Manitoba to the northern Northwest Territories. The stated goal by Ottawa is to obtain a formal cession of Indigenous lands in exchange for financial compensations, various supplies, or commitments of assistance in the event of famine. The treaty texts also mention education and health, subjects that will be integrated later into federal policies. For many First Nations, signing these treaties is a difficult choice. They seek to protect their traditional territories and ensure the survival of their communities while facing the drastic decline of the bison, a main dietary staple for some plains groups, notably the Cree, the Assiniboine, and the Blackfoot. Intensive hunting, coupled with the massive arrival of new settlers and the development of infrastructure, disrupts the millennia-old ecosystems. Confronted with the rapid scarcity of game, Indigenous leaders consider that obtaining promises of agricultural aid could be a solution to get through periods of famine. Nonetheless, the rations and tools promised by the federal government are often slow to arrive, worsening an already precarious situation. The Plains Cree, who have long roamed the steppes in search of bison herds, experience poignant moments of distress during the 1870s. Reports tell of particularly harsh winters, during which food reserves are depleted. Epidemics break out in some communities, weakened by malnutrition and the lack of suitable shelters. Cree leaders, aware of the central role of their negotiations with the Canadian government, insist on the need to receive seeds, draft animals, and agricultural teachers. Despite these legitimate demands, the federal bureaucracy shows little responsiveness. The first experimental fields encounter setbacks due to unknown soil, unpredictable climate, and a lack of technical support. In this tumultuous context emerges the anecdote attributed to Pitikwa Hanapiwin, better known as Pound Maker, a Cree chief deeply respected for his negotiating skills and his determination to avoid bloodshed. Although his influence is most prominent in the 1880s, it is reported that he managed to convince a group of indigenous warriors not to attack a nearby fort while not yielding to the authorities' injunctions. By focusing on dialogue and firmness, he obtained the surrender of the military post under his control, allowing both sides to stop the escalation of violence. This gesture gave him renown, embodying the political acumen sought by his people, compromise, justice, but also a certain wariness from the colonial authorities, who feared that such charisma might further unite indigenous communities around common claims.